Ancient beginnings in Mesopotamia. Long before the rise of Rome or the pyramids of Egypt pierced the skies, a cradle of civilization quietly flourished between two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. This region, known as Mesopotamia, meaning land between rivers in Greek, holds the remarkable distinction of being one of the very first places where humanity transitioned from wandering tribes to complex urban societies. Here, amidst the Fertile Crescent's winding waterways and sun-baked plains, the earliest seeds of organized civilization were sown, seeds that would grow into the foundational roots of human history. In these ancient beginnings, the environment played a crucial role. The unpredictable flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers forced early settlers to innovate. At first glance, these waters might have seemed more curse than blessing, rising without warning, washing away huts and fragile crops. But necessity, as it often does, sparked invention. The people of Mesopotamia learned to tame these rivers with irrigation systems, canals, and levees. In doing so, they didn't just control water, they controlled time, harvest, and survival itself. This mastery over their environment allowed for consistent agricultural surplus, and with it the possibility of stability, trade, and growth. A society no longer preoccupied with survival had time to think, organize, and dream. And dream they did. From their labor and imagination rose the very idea of the city. Not just clusters of huts or villages, but true cities, centers of worship, commerce, politics, and social hierarchy. Cities like Uruk and Eridu stood as marvels of early urban development, bustling with craftsmen, priests, merchants, and farmers. In Uruk, often considered the world's first true city, great ziggurats, a kind of terraced step pyramid, began to rise toward the heavens, symbolic of a civilization reaching upward toward the divine. These structures weren't mere temples, they were declarations, etched in mud brick, of a people claiming dominion over the land and seeking favor from gods who watched from above. Religion was deeply woven into the daily fabric of Mesopotamian life. The gods were everywhere, in the rivers, the sun, the storms. Each city had its patron deity, and priests held immense power as intermediaries between the mortal and divine realms. These spiritual beliefs weren't abstract philosophies. They were lived realities that dictated laws, harvest rituals, and even architecture. The Mesopotamians saw the world as a fragile balance between order and chaos, and their gods were both protectors and punishers. To live well was to live in harmony with these divine forces, and so religion became the thread that held society together. But Mesopotamia's true legacy would not just be found in its ziggurats or its deities, it would be etched into clay. Here in the ancient city of Uruk, writing was born. Cuneiform, a system of wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay tablets, began as a practical tool for keeping accounts, records of grain, sheep, and trade. Yet over time, this simple bookkeeping system evolved into something extraordinary. It became a medium for poetry, law, myth, and philosophy. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the earliest known works of literature, was penned in this script, telling the tale of a king's journey through grief, friendship, and the pursuit of immortality. Through writing, Mesopotamians reached across time, preserving their voices for future generations to hear. With cities and writing came governance. As these early city-states grew in wealth and population, the need for structure became paramount. Kings began to emerge, not just as war leaders, but as stewards of divine order. One of the most famous of these early rulers was Gilgamesh himself, whose semi-mythical exploits were recorded in clay. Later came leaders like Sargon of Akkad, who would establish one of the first known empires by uniting the diverse city-states under a single rule. This was not merely a political revolution. It was a reimagining of what human society could be. Centralized rule meant new systems of law, standardized weights and measures, and broader trade networks. And then there was Hammurabi, the Babylonian king whose name still echoes through time thanks to his famous code of laws. Carved onto a basalt stele and displayed for all to see, the Code of Hammurabi was more than a legal document. It was a symbol of justice. It laid down a principle that would resurface again and again in history, that laws, though harsh by today's standards, should be written and known, not arbitrarily imposed. In a world where might so often made right, Mesopotamia dared to imagine a society governed by written principles. Trade flourished along the rivers and across the deserts, connecting Mesopotamia with distant lands. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, timber from Lebanon, and silver from Anatolia found their way into Mesopotamian markets. These exchanges weren't just economic, they were cultural. Ideas, technologies, and beliefs flowed alongside goods, weaving Mesopotamia into a wider tapestry of human interaction. And as their reach expanded, so did their ambitions. Empires rose and fell, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, each leaving behind layers of ruins, artifacts, and innovation. Of course, life in ancient Mesopotamia wasn't all kings and temples. Most people lived modest lives as farmers, herders, or laborers. Their homes were made of mud brick, their days dictated by the sun, their hopes tied to the river's mercy. Yet even in these humble lives, there was dignity. Communities gathered in marketplaces and courtyards. Families passed down stories and traditions. Children were taught respect for the gods and for the rhythms of the land. In these daily rituals, the heartbeat of civilization pulsed steadily forward. The challenges were many: floods, droughts, invasions. Yet the resilience of Mesopotamian society was extraordinary. When one empire crumbled, another would rise. When temples fell, they were rebuilt. When the rivers shifted course, irrigation systems followed. It was a world in constant flux, but out of this motion came endurance. Mesopotamia did not merely endure, it evolved. Its people learned to adapt, to codify, to build upon the knowledge of those who came before. And so, from the dust and reeds of an ancient land, a great experiment began. An experiment in how humans could live together, organize themselves, worship, trade, write, and rule. Mesopotamia did not invent every facet of civilization, but it shaped them in ways that echo through the ages. From their cities came the concept of urban life. From their scribes came the written word. From their kings came law. And from their priests came a sacred vision of order in the universe. To look back at the ancient beginnings in Mesopotamia is not merely to study the past. It is to peer into a mirror, one that reflects the earliest steps of our shared human journey. The echoes of Mesopotamia can still be felt today in the languages we speak, the laws we follow, the cities we build, and the questions we ask about who we are and where we come from. It all began there, in the land between rivers, where the dust met the divine and human beings dared to rise from the soil and declare themselves as builders of something greater. In the quiet rustle of clay tablets, in the crumbling foundations of ziggurats, in the shimmering myths of gods and heroes, the voice of Mesopotamia still whispers. It tells of a time when everything was new, when people learned to shape not only their world, but their destiny. These ancient beginnings were not the end of the story. They were its first great chapter. And in every city that hums with life, in every contract signed, in every child taught to read, that chapter lives on. Hammurabi and the Laws of Babylon. In the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a powerful civilization began to shape not just cities and empires, but the very idea of justice. Among the most influential figures to emerge from this cradle of civilization was Hammurabi, the sixth king of the First Babylonian dynasty. Ascending the throne around 1792 BCE, Hammurabi inherited a modest kingdom. Yet through a combination of military conquest, political alliances, and administrative brilliance, he transformed Babylon into the dominant force of Mesopotamia. But beyond territorial expansion, Hammurabi's true legacy would lie in something far more enduring: his codification of law. The Code of Hammurabi stands today not merely as an artifact of history, but as one of the earliest known sets of written laws, a monumental shift in how societies govern themselves and resolve conflict. Hammurabi ruled during a time of both great opportunity and great instability. The region was fractured into city-states, each vying for control. Through a series of carefully planned military campaigns, Hammurabi consolidated power across Mesopotamia, stretching his influence from the Persian Gulf to modern-day Syria. Yet even as he expanded his territory, he recognized that true control could not rest on military power alone. He needed a system that would unify his diverse and often fractious population. In response, he commissioned a set of laws that would serve as a universal code, something that would standardize justice across his kingdom and enshrine the king as the divine source of order and fairness. Carved into a towering basalt stele over 7 feet tall, the Code of Hammurabi contains 282 laws, each etched meticulously in Akkadian cuneiform script. At the top of this stele, a striking relief shows Hammurabi receiving the laws from Shamash, the Mesopotamian god of justice and the sun. This image wasn't just decorative, it was deeply symbolic. It presented Hammurabi not merely as a ruler, but as a divinely chosen intermediary between the gods and his people. The laws that followed, therefore, carried a divine weight, lending them legitimacy and authority that transcended any earthly ruler. The code itself reveals a society that was complex, hierarchical, and deeply concerned with justice, though justice, in this context, often meant strict retribution. The famous principle of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth originates here. This concept, known as lex talionis, aimed to limit excessive punishment and ensure that penalties were proportionate to the offense. It reflected a society grappling with fairness and deterrence, yet deeply stratified. The penalties for crimes often depended not just on the act itself, but on the social status of the perpetrator and the victim. A noble and a commoner might receive drastically different sentences for the same crime, underscoring the rigid class divisions of the time. One of the most fascinating aspects of the code is how it deals with a wide range of issues, everything from theft and assault to marriage, inheritance, debt, and even the wages of ox drivers. This breadth highlights a society striving to regulate every corner of civic and economic life, ensuring stability and predictability in an otherwise volatile world. It wasn't just a legal document, it was a blueprint for governance, social order, and daily life. It provided clarity in a world where customs and oral traditions had long governed behavior, shifting the foundations of justice from memory to stone. Justice under Hammurabi was not blind, however. The laws make explicit distinctions based on gender, class, and occupation. A wealthy landowner had different rights than a tenant farmer. A male had more legal standing than a female. Still, the very act of writing laws down was revolutionary. For perhaps the first time, people could point to a fixed reference for what was legal or illegal. It reduced the arbitrariness of rulings, replacing whims of local judges or officials with a shared code that, at least in theory, applied throughout the land. This act of codification laid the groundwork for the idea of the rule of law, a concept that would resonate for millennia. Yet, despite its harshness and limitations, the Code of Hammurabi offered a vision of justice that prioritized responsibility, reciprocity, and order. It demanded that builders be held accountable if a house they constructed collapsed and killed its occupants. It established rights for wives and children within marriages, and even provided certain protections for slaves, who, though treated as property, had legal standing in some disputes. In these ways, it reflected an attempt to balance the needs of the state with the rights of individuals, even within a highly unequal social structure. What makes Hammurabi's code so remarkable is not just that it was created, but that it endured. Long after Hammurabi's death around 1750 BCE, the stele bearing his laws was preserved, studied, and even revered by later civilizations. The Elamites, who eventually conquered Babylon, carried the stele back to their capital as a trophy. Ironically, this act of looting helped preserve it, allowing modern archaeologists to uncover it at Susa in present-day Iran in 1901. Its discovery caused a sensation, providing an unprecedented glimpse into the legal, economic, and social fabric of ancient Mesopotamia. Today, it resides in the Louvre Museum in Paris, standing as a testament to the legal ingenuity and administrative foresight of one of history's earliest lawgivers. Hammurabi's code also casts a long shadow over subsequent legal traditions. The idea that laws should be codified and accessible influenced later cultures, including the Hebrews, Greeks, and Romans. It helped cement the notion that a just society requires more than brute force. It requires structure, fairness, and accountability. In some ways, the laws etched on that black basalt stone anticipated modern principles of justice: due process, proportionality in punishment, and the notion that the state has a duty to protect the weak from the strong. But it is also essential to view Hammurabi's code not through a modern lens, but in the context of its time. In a world where warlords and tribal customs often held sway, the code represented a remarkable step towards centralized governance and social cohesion. It brought order to an expanding empire and offered its citizens, however imperfectly, a sense of legal security. This was a world still ruled by gods and omens, yet here was a king proposing that justice could be rational, documented, and enforced through human institutions. For a voiceover script, the story of Hammurabi and his laws should unfold not as a dry legal treatise, but as a dramatic turning point in the human story. It's a tale of ambition and wisdom, of divine symbolism and practical governance. It's about how a single ruler tried to hold together a vast and diverse empire, not just through the sword, but through the pen. The enduring nature of Hammurabi's legacy lies in the realization that justice, even in its earliest forms, is a human endeavor, constructed, debated, refined. It begins with the question of how we live together, and it continues through codes ancient and modern in our never-ending search for fairness and order. So as we look back at the towering figure of Hammurabi, we don't just see a king or a conqueror. We see the spark of something far more powerful. The idea that laws can bind a people not through fear alone, but through a shared understanding of right and wrong. We see the birth of a concept that continues to shape every courtroom, constitution, and civil society in the world today. And carved into that black stone, preserved through centuries of war and time, is a message from nearly 4,000 years ago, a message that still speaks to us, reminding us that civilization begins where justice is written down and made known to all. Assyrian power and brutality. The Assyrian Empire, rising from the heart of Mesopotamia, carved a reputation through history as one of the most formidable and fearsome forces of the ancient world. Its legacy is deeply etched in both awe and terror, remembered for immense military prowess, iron-fisted rule, and a brutal approach to conquest that earned it notoriety far beyond its own borders. The Assyrians didn't just rule, they dominated with an unapologetic, ruthless efficiency that transformed them into a superpower of the ancient Near East. This script delves into the raw and thunderous force of Assyrian power, examining the terrifying machinery that allowed them to shape and scar the ancient world. Emerging from the northern region of Mesopotamia, in what is today modern Iraq, the Assyrians first began to rise to prominence in the early 2nd millennium BCE. At first, they were one of many regional players, but over centuries, they refined the tools of war and governance until they became an unstoppable imperial machine. Cities such as Ashur and Nineveh became centers of both sophisticated administration and military strategy, anchoring an empire that would stretch from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea at its height. What distinguished the Assyrians most, however, was their unapologetic use of brutality as a tool of statecraft. Where other empires might have blended diplomacy with violence, the Assyrians turned cruelty into a form of psychological warfare. Their kings took pride in their savagery, documenting their victories on massive stone reliefs and clay tablets with explicit detail, gloating over piles of severed heads, flayed enemies, and conquered cities turned to ash. These were not just records, they were warnings to anyone who might consider resistance. To defy Assyria was to invite annihilation. One of the key architects of this brutal vision was Ashur-nasirpal II, who ruled in the 9th century BCE. Under his reign, Assyria began a period of aggressive expansion, and with it, the birth of a terror-based policy that defined the empire's identity. His campaigns were marked by mass deportations, public executions, and the destruction of entire populations. Ashur-nasirpal was not content with merely defeating his enemies. He sought to obliterate their memory. He would often leave survivors only to spread tales of horror back to their cities. This strategy proved chillingly effective. Entire regions surrendered without a fight, choosing subjugation over slaughter. The use of deportation was another brutal hallmark of the Assyrian Empire. Unlike modern deportations driven by diplomacy or law, the Assyrian version was a tool of dominance. Entire communities, thousands at a time, were forcibly uprooted from their homelands and scattered across the empire. This policy served dual purposes. It punished rebellion and diluted local loyalties, replacing them with dependency on the Central Assyrian authority. It was a chillingly effective form of psychological control, creating a mosaic of displaced peoples too fragmented to rise against the state. But Assyrian brutality was not random. It was calculated, systematic, and engineered into every layer of their governance. Their military was one of the most advanced of its time, equipped with iron weapons, chariots, and siege engines that brought destruction to the gates of even the most fortified cities. The Assyrians were innovators in war, using engineers to construct massive ramps, battering rams, and even early forms of sappers to undermine city walls. Their commanders were not just warriors, but tacticians who understood logistics, intimidation, and rapid mobilization. This made them not just deadly, but terrifyingly efficient. The psychological impact of Assyrian warfare extended far beyond the battlefield. Their empire maintained one of the most sophisticated networks of roads and communication systems seen in the ancient world. Messages could be relayed with astonishing speed, allowing the central government to respond quickly to threats. This infrastructure, while a marvel of administration, also served to amplify fear. A rebellion in one region could be crushed swiftly and ruthlessly, with news of the punishment spreading rapidly to others. The message was clear: the eye of the empire was everywhere, and its wrath was merciless. Assyrian kings embraced this image of divine avenger. They styled themselves as chosen by the gods, particularly the war deity Ashur, to bring order through conquest. This theocratic justification gave their violence an aura of righteousness. Massacres and enslavements were framed as sacred duties, purging the world of chaos and impiety. The fusion of religion and brutality created an empire where power was absolute, unquestioned, and terrifying. The king was not just a ruler, he was a living extension of divine will. Among the most fearsome rulers of the Assyrian Empire was Tiglath-Pileser III, who reigned in the 8th century BCE. He reorganized the military and expanded the empire's reach through swift, crushing campaigns. His reign saw the formalization of vassal states, where local rulers were allowed to govern only so long as they paid tribute and remained loyal. Should they rebel, their cities were razed and their people slaughtered or scattered. This carrot and stick approach further entrenched Assyrian control, but it also sowed deep resentment that would fester for generations. Perhaps the pinnacle of Assyrian might and cruelty came under the reign of Sennacherib, whose campaign against Babylon remains one of the most infamous acts of ancient vengeance. When the Babylonians rebelled against Assyrian rule, Sennacherib responded with apocalyptic fury. He didn't just defeat Babylon, he destroyed it. Temples were desecrated, walls demolished, and the city was leveled so thoroughly that he boasted it had been turned into a swamp. The destruction of such a revered cultural and religious center shocked the ancient world, but it was precisely this kind of spectacle that the Assyrians believed ensured their dominance. Even their art and architecture reflected this brutal ideology. The grand palaces of Nineveh and Nimrud were adorned with reliefs that depicted floggings, impalements, and sieges in vivid detail. These were not merely decorations, they were declarations of power. Foreign dignitaries walking through these halls would be greeted not by symbols of peace, but by relentless reminders of what resistance to Assyria would mean. Even the gods depicted in Assyrian art often held weapons, their divine favor intertwined with militaristic dominance. However, the very ruthlessness that built the Assyrian Empire also sowed the seeds of its fall. As centuries passed, the oppressed peoples of the empire nursed their grievances. The deported, the conquered, and the humiliated never forgot their suffering. Eventually, alliances formed among former enemies, and internal unrest weakened the empire from within. By the end of the 7th century BCE, a coalition of Babylonians, Medes, and others rose up to topple the empire. The once unstoppable Assyrian war machine crumbled in a matter of years, culminating in the fall of Nineveh in 612 BCE. The end of the Assyrian Empire was as dramatic as its reign. The great cities were burned, the palaces looted, and the once feared army scattered. For centuries afterward, the memory of Assyria remained a dark shadow in the annals of history, a symbol of power unrestrained and cruelty institutionalized. It became a warning for future empires. Dominance achieved through terror may rise quickly, but it does not endure. And yet, even in its fall, the legacy of Assyria could not be erased. The administrative systems they built, the military strategies they pioneered, and even their concept of empire influenced the powers that followed, from the Babylonians to the Persians and beyond. Their texts survived, buried under the sands, and rediscovered by archaeologists thousands of years later, revealing a civilization both brilliant and brutal. The story of Assyrian power is not one of heroes or idealism. It is a tale of calculated violence, imperial ambition, and the devastating cost of conquest. It is a reminder that in the hands of empire, power and brutality often march together. The Assyrians built an empire of fear, and for a time, that fear ruled the world. But like all things built on terror, it could not last. In its ruins, we are left to contemplate the limits of domination and the enduring question of what it means to rule, not just with strength, but with justice. The world remembers the Assyrians not for their compassion, but for the echo of their cruelty, carved into stone and whispered through the ages. Babylon's Golden Age. In the cradle of ancient civilization, nestled between the life-giving waters of the Tigris and Euphrates, stood a city that for a time shone brighter than any other, Babylon. It was not merely a city of bricks and mortar. It was a cultural beacon, an intellectual powerhouse, and the very heart of one of the ancient world's most magnificent empires. Babylon's Golden Age was a time of astonishing achievements in science, art, architecture, law, and governance. It was a moment in history when the human spirit soared to breathtaking heights, powered by the promise of order, beauty, and enlightened rule. To speak of Babylon's Golden Age is to enter a world where myth and history intertwine. It is a place immortalized by tales of wonder and wisdom, by gardens that touch the heavens, and by rulers who claimed the favor of gods. But far beyond the myths, there existed a real society, complex, dynamic, and astonishingly advanced for its time. This golden era is most commonly associated with the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled in the 6th century BCE and left behind a legacy that would resonate across millennia. Under Nebuchadnezzar's leadership, Babylon transformed from a regional power into a dazzling imperial capital. The king envisioned more than just military conquest. He saw himself as a restorer of divine order, a patron of the arts, and a guardian of knowledge. His rule marked a flourishing of Mesopotamian culture, rooted in centuries of tradition, yet innovatively reimagined for a new age. The skyline of Babylon, once modest, rose into a spectacle of colossal walls, stately temples, and vast palaces, all adorned with intricate bas-reliefs and glazed tiles in lapis blue and golden ochre. The city itself was designed not just for utility, but for splendor. Its double walls, said by ancient historians to be wide enough to allow chariots to race atop them, served both as fortification and as a bold statement of power. The famed Ishtar Gate, with its brilliant blue bricks and reliefs of lions and dragons, stood as a testament to both the technological sophistication and the aesthetic brilliance of Babylon's artisans. Passing through it was not merely a physical act, it was a symbolic journey into a realm blessed by the gods and governed by divine order. Perhaps nothing encapsulates the grandeur of Babylon's Golden Age more than the legendary Hanging Gardens. Though their existence remains debated among historians, their very legend speaks volumes about the ambitions and imagination of Babylonian civilization. Said to have been constructed by Nebuchadnezzar for his Median wife, who longed for the green mountains of her homeland, the gardens were described as a tiered wonder, with lush vegetation spilling from every level. They were a marvel of engineering as much as of horticulture, possibly employing advanced irrigation systems to keep them verdant in the arid Mesopotamian climate. Beyond its monumental architecture, Babylon thrived as a center of learning and intellectual inquiry. Scholars gathered in the temples and palaces where they compiled astronomical data, refined mathematical systems, and preserved medical knowledge. Babylonian astronomers charted the movements of planets and stars with astonishing precision, creating early forms of the zodiac and anticipating celestial cycles long before such understanding reached the West. Their observations, recorded in cuneiform on clay tablets, reveal a meticulous and methodical approach to science that continues to impress modern researchers. In mathematics, Babylonian contributions were equally profound. They used a base 60 number system, which is why we still divide hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees. They solved quadratic equations, calculated square roots, and developed geometrical insights that laid the groundwork for future civilizations. Unlike the Greeks, who pursued abstract reasoning, the Babylonians were practical mathematicians, driven by the demands of land measurement, tax assessment, and architectural planning. Yet, their practicality never dulled their precision. Babylon was also a city of law and order, a legacy built on the foundations laid centuries earlier by Hammurabi but refined and expanded under later rulers. Legal contracts inscribed on tablets document everything from commercial transactions to marriage arrangements, showing a highly organized society with well-defined norms. Property rights, inheritance laws, labor agreements, these were not ad hoc customs, but codified rules that shaped daily life and enforced accountability. This legalism fostered a climate of predictability and stability critical for the economic prosperity of a vast and diverse empire. Religion in Babylon was more than faith. It was the very spine of society. The city's chief deity was Marduk, god of wisdom and justice, whose temple, the Esagila, towered at the city's center, adjacent to the great Ziggurat Etemenanki, a step pyramid that some scholars believe inspired the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. The rituals carried out in these sacred spaces were complex, precise, and deeply woven into the political machinery of the state. The king was not only a ruler but also a high priest, a mediator between the divine and mortal realms. Festivals such as the New Year, Akitu, were not mere celebrations. They reaffirmed the cosmic order and the king's divine right to govern. Economically, Babylon flourished as a hub of trade and agriculture. The city's position near the convergence of rivers made it a nexus for commerce, attracting merchants from across the Near East. Markets bustled with goods from India, Arabia, and the Mediterranean, spices, textiles, precious stones, and grains. The Babylonians developed an intricate system of weights and measures, and their use of silver as a standard of exchange hinted at early concepts of money and banking. Clay tablets from this period reveal an economy humming with activity, credit systems, loans with interest, and even investment partnerships. Art and literature, too, reached new heights. Babylonian scribes copied and created myths, hymns, and epics that carried the weight of collective memory. The Epic of Gilgamesh, though older in origin, was recopied and revered in Babylonian libraries. It was more than a story. It was a philosophical exploration of mortality, friendship, and the quest for meaning. Babylonian literature delved into cosmology, theodicy, and human purpose. These texts were not hidden treasures. They were actively studied, recited, and taught in scribal schools where education was rigorous and respected. Women in Babylonian society, though constrained by patriarchal norms, had certain rights that varied based on class and context. Some owned property, ran businesses, and held contracts in their own names. While elite women had more visibility in religious and economic life, even ordinary women navigated a legal and social world that recognized their agency in specific domains. This complexity speaks to a civilization that, while hierarchical, was also remarkably structured and nuanced. Yet, for all its glory, Babylon's golden age was not immune to the tides of change. Its splendor attracted the envy of other powers. The Persian conquest under Cyrus the Great in 539 BCE marked the end of Babylonian independence, though not necessarily the end of its cultural influence. Cyrus respected Babylonian traditions and styled himself as a liberator rather than a conqueror. Even so, the age of Babylonian supremacy had passed, absorbed into a new imperial system. And still, the legacy of Babylon endured. Greek scholars like Herodotus and later Roman thinkers wrote admiringly of its wonders. Biblical texts, though often critical of Babylon's arrogance, acknowledged its magnificence. Islamic scholars preserved and expanded upon Babylonian knowledge during the Golden Age of Baghdad. And in the modern era, archaeologists unearthing the remnants of Babylon have been astonished by the sophistication of what they found. Babylon's Golden Age teaches us that greatness is not merely a matter of wealth or power, but of vision that marries order with imagination, tradition with innovation. It was an age when the arts flourished, not as isolated endeavors, but as expressions of a society in harmony with itself. It was a moment in time when the human desire to understand the world reached toward the stars, even as its feet remained grounded in the fertile earth of Mesopotamia. The story of Babylon is not just the story of one city or one empire. It is the story of humanity striving toward its highest ideals, toward beauty, knowledge, justice, and cosmic balance. In every artifact, in every clay tablet, in every myth retold, there echoes the enduring brilliance of a civilization that for a golden moment lit the path forward for all who followed. And yet, Beyond the physical achievements and administrative brilliance of Babylon, there existed something less tangible, but just as vital, an atmosphere of intellectual curiosity and spiritual depth. Babylon was not simply a place of temples and markets, it was a living mind, constantly questioning, interpreting, and redefining its place in the cosmos. This internal richness gave Babylon a soul, a cultural heartbeat that pulsed through every written tablet, every carved relief, and every ceremonial procession. The scribes, those guardians of knowledge, played a critical role in shaping and preserving Babylon's legacy. Trained from a young age in the difficult art of cuneiform writing, they were the keepers of wisdom, chroniclers of history, and advisors to kings. They recorded astronomical events, interpreted omens, drafted contracts, and copied myths. Their work was painstaking and meticulous, for they understood that they were not merely documenting daily affairs. They were transmitting the very essence of Babylonian identity to future generations. In their hands, history became more than a chronicle of rulers and wars. It became a mirror of divine will. The Babylonians believed that the movements of the stars, the births of animals, and the shapes of clouds were messages from the gods. Divination was not superstition in their eyes. It was a sophisticated system of decoding cosmic signals. The priests who interpreted these signs were not blind prophets. They were trained experts, consulting vast libraries of omens collected over centuries, seeking patterns in chaos and clarity in uncertainty. Their religion, far from being simplistic polytheism, was a structured cosmology that placed humanity within a grander divine framework. The myth of creation, the Enuma Elish, recounted how the god Marduk subdued chaos and created order, a theme that echoed in how the Babylonians sought to organize their world. In this myth, the universe was born from conflict, but it was shaped into stability through divine wisdom. This same wisdom, they believed, could be mirrored in just kingship, well-ordered cities, and harmonious living. Music, too, held an essential place in this society. Although few instruments have survived, textual evidence and artistic depictions suggest a vibrant musical culture. Harps, lyres, drums, and flutes accompanied religious rituals, festivals, and palace banquets. Music was more than entertainment. It was a bridge to the divine, a rhythmic echo of the cosmic harmony Marduk had established. Through chant and melody, the Babylonians celebrated their gods, mourned their dead, and marked the passage of time. Drama and ritual were intertwined. The New Year festival, Akitu, was not merely a celebration of seasonal renewal. It was a reenactment of the creation myth itself. In those sacred days, the king humbled himself before the high priest, was symbolically struck, and then reaffirmed as the divinely chosen ruler. This drama reinforced the king's legitimacy, the city's sanctity, and the continued favor of the gods. It was political theater and spiritual rite, blending performance with governance in a way that reaffirmed Babylon's vision of order over chaos. Their cities, while monumental, were also surprisingly well organized for their time. Streets were laid out in careful grids, water was managed through canals and reservoirs, and neighborhoods were often organized by trade or family. This orderliness extended to domestic architecture. Houses, while modest compared to temples and palaces, were built with a strong understanding of privacy, ventilation, and communal space. The ordinary Babylonian citizen, though living in the shadow of ziggurats and royal grandeur, participated in a society that prized structure, routine, and balance. Even leisure reflected this sense of balance. Games such as the royal game of whose origins predate Babylon but continued to be popular during its golden age, reveal a society that valued both strategy and chance. These games were not trivial pastimes. They often carried symbolic meaning and were sometimes associated with divination. The simple act of play, then, became a microcosm of the Babylonian worldview, a dance between fate and decision, between divine will and human agency. As the empire grew, Babylon became increasingly cosmopolitan. Aramaic joined Akkadian as a common spoken language. Foreign diplomats, traders, and artisans brought new ideas and customs. Rather than resist, the Babylonians often absorbed these influences, blending them into their own traditions. Their culture was elastic, yet enduring, capable of evolving without losing its core identity. This adaptability was one of their greatest strengths and a key reason their intellectual legacy survived long after political power had faded. Their medical texts reveal an advanced understanding of disease, diagnosis, and treatment. Babylonian physicians operated within a dual framework: observational medicine and spiritual healing. Tablets describe how to treat wounds, set bones, and administer herbal remedies while also invoking gods to drive out illness-causing spirits. Far from contradictory, these approaches reflected a worldview where the physical and spiritual were two sides of the same reality. Healing was not just the restoration of the body, it was the rebalancing of the cosmos within the individual. Trade, as ever, was the lifeblood of this civilization. Caravans stretched across deserts, riverboats drifted along the Euphrates, and port cities bustled with the activity of commerce. Goods moved, but so did ideas. Philosophical musings, mathematical theorems, and religious rituals found new homes in distant lands. Babylon was not only the recipient of influence, it was a fountainhead, a cultural exporter, a shining node in the web of the ancient world. It is remarkable how much of what we consider foundational to modern civilization can be traced back to Babylon's golden legacy. The keeping of time, the division of space, the codification of law, and the institutionalization of learning, these did not spring from nowhere. They were forged in the heat of Mesopotamian imagination, tempered by centuries of trial and refinement, and passed on like a torch to those who followed. Even today, the name Babylon endures. It has come to symbolize both grandeur and hubris, wisdom and excess, enlightenment and moral warning. Artists, writers, theologians, and philosophers have returned time and again to the image of Babylon, sometimes to praise it, sometimes to caution against it, but always to acknowledge its deep hold on the human psyche. That we still speak of it today, millennia after its walls fell silent, is perhaps the truest testament to the brilliance of its golden age. The ruins may be worn by wind and time, but the echoes of Babylon live on, in our languages, our cities, our systems of thought. It is a city that dreamed of the eternal and reached for the heavens. Though its towers have crumbled and its temples lie buried in dust, its legacy stands tall, etched not in stone, but in the enduring achievements of the human spirit. Persia and the Fall of Babylon. The story of Persia and the fall of Babylon is a sweeping saga of political brilliance, military precision, and profound historical transformation. As the mighty Babylonian Empire reached the zenith of its power, few could have predicted that its downfall would come not from within, but from a rising force in the east, a power that would soon reshape the ancient world. This is the story of how the Persian Empire, under the leadership of Cyrus the Great, emerged from obscurity to challenge and ultimately conquer the most formidable empire of its time, signaling not just a change in rule, but a shift in the very nature of governance, culture, and imperial ideology. In the 6th century BCE, Babylon stood as a beacon of Mesopotamian civilization. Its towering walls, legendary hanging gardens, and opulent temples symbolized a civilization steeped in tradition, wealth, and grandeur. It was a city that commanded awe and fear, a seat of imperial might and cultural sophistication. Under the reign of King Nabonidus, however, Babylon began to exhibit signs of internal strain. Though a capable administrator, Nabonidus was a deeply religious man who prioritized his devotion to the moon god Sin over the traditional patron deity of Babylon, Marduk. His neglect of Babylon's religious customs, his prolonged absence from the capital during long stays in Arabia, and his controversial reforms created discontent among the powerful priesthood and segments of the population. Babylon, for all its power, was becoming vulnerable from within, even as its enemies observed from afar. To the east, the Persians, a once marginal group among the many Iranian tribes, were rapidly rising under the leadership of Cyrus II, later known as Cyrus the Great. Born around 600 BCE, Cyrus displayed extraordinary acumen early in life, not only in warfare, but in diplomacy and governance. He united the Persian tribes and overthrew the Medes, establishing the Achaemenid Empire. His vision extended far beyond regional dominance. Cyrus sought to build an empire unlike any the world had seen, a realm of tolerance, integration, and administrative innovation. His military campaigns were swift and strategic, but his genius lay not just in conquest, but in the aftermath. He positioned himself not merely as a conqueror, but as a liberator and a rightful ruler to the people he subdued. As Cyrus expanded his empire westward, his eyes inevitably turned toward Babylon. The empire's discontent under Nabonidus presented a ripe opportunity. Cyrus capitalized on widespread dissatisfaction among the Babylonians, especially among the priesthood of Marduk, who resented Nabonidus for sidelining their god. Cyrus, in a masterstroke of propaganda and diplomacy, positioned himself as the chosen of Marduk, a foreign ruler divinely sanctioned to restore the city to its rightful glory. Babylon, once the dominator of others, now found itself encircled not just militarily, but ideologically and spiritually. In 539 BCE, the Persian army led by General Gobryas approached Babylon. The city, with its thick, towering walls and reputation for impenetrability, seemed secure. However, Cyrus had no intention of laying siege in the traditional sense. Instead, the Persians executed one of the most ingenious military maneuvers of the ancient world. Utilizing the Euphrates River that ran through Babylon, Cyrus ordered his troops to divert the river's flow upstream, lowering the water level to a manageable depth. Under cover of night, Persian soldiers entered the city by wading through the riverbed, breaching the formidable defenses without a prolonged battle or widespread destruction. The fall of Babylon was as swift as it was shocking. The city was taken with barely a struggle, a testament to both the brilliance of Persian tactics and the extent of internal dissatisfaction within Babylon. According to the Cyrus cylinder, an ancient clay artifact often regarded as the first declaration of human rights, the people of Babylon welcomed Cyrus as a liberator. He was portrayed as a restorer of temples, a protector of traditions, and a ruler who respected the customs and gods of his new subjects. Whether this portrayal was entirely accurate or the product of political messaging, it marked a stark departure from the often brutal transitions of power common in ancient conquests. With the conquest of Babylon, Cyrus inherited not only the territories and wealth of the Babylonian Empire, but also its administrative apparatus, cultural heritage, and symbolic significance. Babylon, though conquered, remained intact, its temples undisturbed, its citizens unharmed, its bureaucratic structure largely preserved. Cyrus's approach was pragmatic and visionary. Rather than obliterate Babylonian identity, he incorporated it into his empire, recognizing its value as a cultural and religious epicenter. This policy of tolerance and integration would become a hallmark of the Achaemenid Empire, setting it apart from many earlier and later imperial models. The fall of Babylon also marked a turning point in Near Eastern history. It signaled the end of an era dominated by Mesopotamian city-states and ushered in the age of Persian hegemony. Under the Achaemenids, the Persian Empire would grow to become the largest the world had ever seen, stretching from the Indus Valley in the east to the Aegean Sea in the west, from the Caucasus Mountains in the north to the Persian Gulf in the south. But this vast dominion was held together not just by military might, but by the administrative genius first demonstrated by Cyrus, the use of satrapies or provinces, each governed by local leaders who were accountable to the central authority, the construction of roads and communication systems, the use of standardized coinage and languages, and most importantly, the respect for local traditions, laws, and religions. Cyrus's conquest of Babylon reverberated far beyond the walls of the city. Among the most consequential outcomes was his decree allowing exiled peoples to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples, most notably the Jewish exiles in Babylon. The Bible records Cyrus as a divinely appointed figure who permitted the Jews to return to Jerusalem and reconstruct their temple, earning him a unique place in both historical and religious narratives. This act not only strengthened his image as a just and benevolent ruler, but also forged enduring bonds with diverse communities across his empire. In the years following the fall of Babylon, the city remained a vital center of commerce, learning, and culture within the Persian Empire. While it no longer held the political supremacy it once did under Nebuchadnezzar and his predecessors, it thrived under Persian rule as a jewel of the Achaemenid realm. The fusion of Babylonian and Persian traditions created a rich tapestry of cultural exchange, intellectual growth, and architectural innovation. Yet even as Babylon flourished under new management, its symbolic role shifted. No longer the unchallenged heart of empire, it became one of many important cities in a vast and diverse realm. Its fall was not a mere episode of military conquest, but a profound transformation in the nature of empire itself, from domination to inclusion, from destruction to coexistence. Cyrus the Great's vision reshaped the political map of the ancient world, establishing principles that would influence empires for centuries to come. The legacy of Persia's conquest of Babylon endures not only in the ruins and records of ancient cities, but in the very idea of empire. It posed a radical notion that might need not be accompanied by cruelty, that diversity could be a strength rather than a weakness, and that power, tempered with respect and diplomacy, could yield lasting stability. In an age of brutal conquests and cyclical violence, Cyrus's model offered an alternative, one rooted in pragmatism, empathy, and strategic foresight. His empire was not perfect, but it stood as a compelling example of how the ancient world could be governed with both strength and wisdom. Thus, the fall of Babylon was not merely an end, but a beginning, the closing chapter of one empire and the opening verse of another. It was the moment when the ancient world turned eastward, toward the rising star of Persia, and witnessed the dawn of an imperial age unlike any before it. Cyrus the Great's entrance into Babylon was more than a military triumph. It was a transformative act that redefined what it meant to rule. Alexander the Great in Mesopotamia. In 331 BCE, the thunder of hooves echoed across the Mesopotamian plains as Alexander the Great, one of history's most legendary conquerors, entered the cradle of civilization. His eyes, shaped by dreams of empire and glory, now turned to the rich and ancient lands between the Tigris and Euphrates. This was not merely a campaign of conquest, it was a symbolic march into the heart of antiquity, a place that had seen the rise and fall of empires long before Macedon had risen. For Alexander, Mesopotamia was not just territory to be claimed, it was a jewel of cultural and historical significance, and perhaps a final step toward fulfilling the legacy of both Greek heroism and Persian dominion. The journey into Mesopotamia came in the wake of a decisive moment in Alexander's career, the Battle of Gaugamela. This confrontation, occurring near present-day Mosul, was more than a clash of armies. It was the moment when the world order tilted. On one side stood Darius III, the last king of the Achaemenid Empire, commanding a force that vastly outnumbered Alexander's. On the other side, the Macedonian king, outnumbered but tactically brilliant, inspired unwavering loyalty and courage in his men. The battle was brutal, chaotic, and transformative. Against staggering odds, Alexander's disciplined phalanx formations, cavalry maneuvering, and psychological warfare overcame the Persian forces. Darius fled, and with his retreat, the Persian hold over Mesopotamia began to crumble. As Alexander moved deeper into Mesopotamia, he was no longer seen merely as an invader. To many, he became a liberator, or at least the new face of imperial power. Babylon, the ancient city of wonders, opened its gates without resistance. Its priests and people welcomed him, offering him the regalia of kingship. In a place where Nebuchadnezzar had once ruled and Hammurabi had shaped early laws, Alexander now stood as the new master. He did not raise the city or impose immediate change. Instead, he respected its customs and religious rites. He offered sacrifices to the Babylonian gods and reinstated temples and priests that had been neglected under Persian rule. This wasn't just diplomacy. It was Alexander's strategic genius. He knew the power of perception, of aligning himself with local traditions to build legitimacy. Mesopotamia, with its fertile lands and centuries of cultural sophistication, was crucial to Alexander's vision of a united empire stretching from Greece to India. He didn't see conquest as merely territorial. He sought integration, a fusion of East and West. In Babylon, he began implementing policies that reflected this vision. He took Persian officials into his administration, encouraged intermarriage, and even adopted elements of Persian dress and ceremony. To his Macedonian followers, these choices were sometimes bewildering, even offensive. But to Alexander, they were part of a broader, bolder experiment, the creation of a new world order where the distinctions of East and West would blur into a single imperial identity. Yet Alexander's time in Mesopotamia was not without challenges. The administrative systems left behind by the Persians were deeply entrenched, and local governors, satraps, often had their own agendas. Alexander had to balance loyalty and pragmatism, sometimes keeping Persian officials in power if they proved competent, and at other times replacing them with trusted Macedonian officers. Rebellions flared sporadically, not just from native populations, but also from within his own ranks. Discontent simmered among his men, who grew weary of the long campaigns and uneasy with their leaders' increasingly foreign mannerisms. But Alexander's charisma, his near-mythic aura, continued to hold his empire together, at least for a time. In Babylon, Alexander found more than just strategic value. He saw a city that symbolized grandeur, ambition, and the legacy of kingship. He began vast reconstruction projects, intending to make Babylon not merely a provincial capital, but the heart of his envisioned empire. Canals were cleaned and restored, temples rebuilt, and palaces renovated. He even planned to make Babylon his imperial seat, moving the capital of his realm from the Greek world to the Mesopotamian core. This choice was radical. It signaled his desire not to return to Macedon as a conqueror, but to stay and rule as a global emperor. Mesopotamia would be the fulcrum upon which his empire balanced. But fate had other plans. In 323 BCE, just as the foundations of this vision were taking form, Alexander fell ill in Babylon. Over several days, his condition worsened. Fever gripped him, and despite the prayers of priests and the care of his physicians, he did not recover. In the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, amidst plans for new campaigns and grand unifications, the world's greatest conqueror breathed his last. He was only 32. Alexander's death in Mesopotamia was profoundly symbolic. It was in this ancient land where writing was born, where the first cities had risen, that the life of one of history's most dynamic figures ended. Babylon, once a city of beginnings, now became a place of finality. Yet even in death, Alexander's presence in Mesopotamia lingered. His body was mummified in accordance with both Greek and Eastern customs, and though it was eventually taken to Egypt, the memory of his rule remained etched in the Mesopotamian mind. The power vacuum left behind was immense. His generals, known as the Diadochi, divided his empire and began a series of wars that would fragment the unity he had fought so hard to achieve. Mesopotamia, in this chaos, became a contested ground. Seleucus, one of Alexander's most capable lieutenants, eventually took control of the eastern provinces and established the Seleucid Empire, which would rule Mesopotamia for generations. Under Seleucid rule, the cities of Mesopotamia saw a resurgence of Hellenistic influence. Greek became the language of administration and education, yet the deep roots of Mesopotamian culture endured. Temples still rose to ancient gods, and native traditions found ways to persist alongside the Greek innovations. Alexander's brief but impactful presence in Mesopotamia was not merely a footnote in his grand campaign. It was a defining episode, a convergence of ancient legacies and new ambitions. His attempt to integrate cultures, to blur the lines between conqueror and native, set a precedent that future empires would both admire and struggle to replicate. He saw in Mesopotamia not just a land to be ruled, but a center to be revitalized, a symbol of unity in a diverse world. In many ways, his time in Mesopotamia embodies the duality of his legacy. On one hand, he was a destroyer of worlds, toppling empires and reshaping borders with military force. On the other, he was a dreamer, a man who saw beyond geography and heritage, imagining a world where knowledge, power, and belief systems could coexist and merge. The temples he restored, the roads he rebuilt, and the policies he enacted were all reflections of this ideal. Today, the ruins of Babylon stand as silent witnesses to that extraordinary time. The cracked bricks and fallen columns carry whispers of a world where East met West, where a Macedonian king walked the same paths as ancient priests and scribes, and where the tides of history momentarily paused as Alexander dared to fuse the old with the new. His time in Mesopotamia, though brief, marked a pivotal moment when history, ambition, and vision collided under the burning sun of a timeless land. In the aftermath of Alexander's death, Mesopotamia found itself at the heart of a vast and crumbling empire. The ambitious plans he laid out, uniting East and West, blending cultures, elevating Babylon as the capital of a new world, were left incomplete. His successors, driven more by rivalry than unity, divided the empire among themselves. Mesopotamia became a critical prize in their power struggles, changing hands multiple times during the wars of the Diadochi. Eventually, Seleucus I Nicator secured control over the region and incorporated it into the Seleucid Empire, one of the major Hellenistic states that emerged from the wreckage of Alexander's dream. Under Seleucid rule, cities such as Seleucia on the Tigris rose to prominence, modeled on Greek urban ideals, but rooted in Mesopotamian geography and history. While Greek influence was profound, seen in architecture, administration, and education, the native traditions of Mesopotamia endured beneath the surface. The gods of old were still worshipped, scribes still recorded in cuneiform, and the rhythms of life along the rivers remained steeped in ancient custom. Though Alexander was gone, his brief rule had ignited a cultural transformation that echoed for centuries, a fusion not of domination but of connection. Mesopotamia would never be the same again, the legacy that shaped the world. In the heart of the ancient world, where rivers gave birth to civilizations and clay tablets first captured the flickers of human thought, a legacy was forged, one not of a single man or empire, but of countless lives interwoven across millennia. This legacy, shaped by innovation, conquest, belief, and the enduring human spirit, became the foundation upon which our modern world rests. It is a story etched in the sun-baked bricks of Mesopotamian cities, whispered through the corridors of crumbling ziggurats, and preserved in the faint traces of cuneiform. It begins not with greatness, but with survival, a testament to humanity's first steps toward shaping the world. Thousands of years ago, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, people began to settle and plant, taming the floodwaters, building canals, and cultivating wheat and barley in the cradle of what would become civilization. These early agriculturalists did more than grow food. They grew communities, cities, and cultures. They constructed temples to honor unseen forces, developed languages to record trade and governance, and began charting the stars to understand their place in the cosmos. They divided time, organized society, and from these innovations sprang the roots of governance, religion, law, and science. Among the most transformative contributions of these early peoples was writing. Cuneiform, etched into wet clay with reed styluses, began as simple record-keeping but quickly evolved into a powerful tool. It enabled the preservation of stories, the administration of cities, and the expression of ideas. Through writing, knowledge could transcend generations, mistakes could be avoided, and wisdom accumulated. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the world's oldest literary works, emerged from this time, not merely a story, but a reflection of the values, fears, and hopes of early humanity. Through this text, the ancient voice reaches across time, reminding us that even then, people wondered about death, friendship, glory, and the meaning of life. But it was not just invention that shaped this legacy, it was ambition. The rise and fall of empires left indelible marks on the world's cultural and political landscapes. The Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, and Persians each rose to prominence, built monumental cities, created systems of governance, and pushed the boundaries of human organization. Hammurabi's code, carved into stone for all to see, marked one of the earliest known attempts to establish a rule of law accessible to all citizens. It wasn't perfect, but it planted a seed that justice could be codified, debated, and upheld not by divine whim alone, but by civic duty. This legacy, too, includes conflict. War was both a tool of power and a force of destruction. Cities were razed, peoples displaced, knowledge lost, but also spread. The conquerors carried not only swords but scrolls, not only banners but ideas. From Sumerian myths to Persian administrative systems, the transmission of culture across borders was as impactful as any battle. With every conquest came cultural fusion, new gods, new customs, new ways of thinking, and in that mixture, humanity evolved. Religion, too, played a central role. The pantheons of Mesopotamia reflected a worldview in which nature and divinity were deeply intertwined. The gods were not distant creators. They were present in the rivers, the sun, the storms, and the grain. They were both nurturing and wrathful, reflecting the unpredictable environment early people faced. Temples were more than places of worship. They were centers of learning, finance, and power. Priests were astronomers, economists, and healers. The merging of the sacred and the scientific created a worldview where spiritual insight and empirical observation were not at odds, but parts of a unified quest to understand reality. Trade routes stretched across vast deserts and mountains, linking the Mesopotamian heartland with the Indus Valley, Egypt, and Anatolia. Goods were exchanged, tin, lapis lazuli, timber, and grain, but so were ideas. Mathematics, astronomical observations, and medical practices traveled with merchants and envoys. The decimal system, the 360-degree circle, the concept of zero, seeds of all these mathematical ideas found early nourishment in the minds of these ancient thinkers. As centuries passed, these civilizations fell into decline, yet their impact did not vanish. The Greeks and Romans absorbed and adapted Mesopotamian knowledge. Medieval Islamic scholars preserved and translated ancient texts, integrating them into a broader body of science and philosophy. The Renaissance in Europe, fueled by rediscovery, owes much to those early clay tablets pulled from the dust. The very idea of civilization as a structured, literate, law-bound society finds its roots in this ancient past. What endures from this legacy is not merely the ruins or relics, but the mindset, the notion that problems can be solved with reason, that stories connect people beyond borders. That time can be measured, laws debated, and nature studied. That human lives, though short, can contribute to something greater. It is the echo of ancient cities in modern metropolises. It is the distant pulse of Sumer in every courtroom, schoolroom, and observatory. Even today, we live among the invisible architecture built by ancient hands. Every time we glance at a calendar, consult a legal code, or observe the heavens with curiosity, we are participants in a tradition thousands of years in the making. The civilizations of ancient Mesopotamia are not dead. They are part of us, a legacy not frozen in time, but living and evolving. In this way, the legacy that shaped the world is not a singular story. It is the accumulation of countless voices, from kings and scribes to farmers and stargazers. It is not just the record of what happened, but of what mattered. And in remembering, in honoring that legacy, we are reminded of our shared responsibility to build with wisdom, to govern with justice, to explore with wonder. Because the future, too, will be shaped by the legacies we leave behind. And yet, as we look back on the legacy that shaped the world, it becomes clear that the true power of these ancient civilizations lay not only in what they built, but in how they thought. The brilliance of Mesopotamia, of Sumer, Babylon, and Assyria was not just in their towering ziggurats or massive walls. It was in the minds that envisioned a world governed by patterns, by systems, by principles that extended beyond the self. These were societies that dared to ask not just how to survive, but how to thrive, how to organize people across time and space into something more than the sum of their parts. This is perhaps most evident in their approach to knowledge. For the Mesopotamians, knowledge was not a luxury, but a necessity. It was meticulously recorded and categorized, not merely for posterity, but to ensure continuity. Scribes became the stewards of civilization, entrusted with everything from religious hymns to administrative accounts. They inscribed not only transactions, but also omens, dreams, and medical diagnoses. These clay tablets, brittle and unassuming, carried the weight of an entire worldview. And while many have crumbled over time, those that remain are windows into the minds of people who lived over 4,000 years ago. Minds that ask the same fundamental questions we ask today. What is our purpose? What governs our fate? How do we live together? The legacy of law and justice left by Hammurabi and his successors also reveals an evolving sense of moral responsibility. Their legal codes, while harsh by modern standards, represented an early attempt to apply consistent rules to human behavior. They sought not only to punish wrongdoing, but to deter it, to create order from chaos. This idea that a society could be governed by a predictable set of laws rather than the whims of the powerful would echo through the centuries. It influenced Roman law, which in turn shaped the legal systems of Europe and beyond. Even today, the notion of equality before the law, the sanctity of contracts, and the role of the state in mediating disputes finds its roots in those first inscribed codes of justice. Science, too, took its first structured steps in these early civilizations. The Mesopotamians observed the heavens not out of idle curiosity, but out of a deep desire to understand and predict. They saw patterns in the stars, recorded eclipses, and developed intricate calendars. These observations were tied to agriculture, to religion, to statecraft, because they believed that the universe was not random, but ordered. This belief laid the groundwork for astronomy, for mathematics, and for the very concept of scientific inquiry. The legacy they left was not just the data, but the method, the belief that through careful observation and record-keeping, knowledge could be built systematically and shared. Moreover, the spiritual legacy of these people shaped the foundations of belief systems for generations. From the complex pantheon of Sumerian gods, with their human-like struggles and celestial domains, emerged ideas that would influence later religious thought across the ancient Near East. The concept of divine justice, of moral consequence, of a higher power governing human affairs, transitioned over time into the monotheistic frameworks that dominate the world today. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all trace cultural and narrative threads back to Mesopotamian concepts of sacred law, divine authority, and cosmic order. And perhaps most profoundly, the legacy that shaped the world is visible in our resilience. These early civilizations endured floods, droughts, invasions, and collapse. But through it all, the spirit of human ingenuity persisted. Even as cities crumbled, knowledge migrated. Even as languages died out, their echoes reemerged in new forms. Even as empires fell, their ideals endured, in stone, in ink, in thought. So as we stand today, surrounded by technology and ideas far removed from those early riverbanks, we must recognize that we are not separate from that past. We are its continuation. We are the inheritors of a vast, unbroken story. A story begun in fields of barley and etched into clay. A story of humans reaching toward the stars, measuring time, recording myths, arguing over justice, building cities, and seeking meaning. This is the legacy that shaped the world, not one of perfection, but of perseverance. A legacy of trial and triumph, of curiosity and courage. And in understanding it, we not only honor those who came before, we better understand who we are and who we might become. Ziggurats and the Gods, Mesopotamian Religion. In the cradle of civilization, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers nurtured the birth of urban life, the spiritual world was inseparable from the material one. The ancient Mesopotamians lived in a universe teeming with divine presence, a pantheon of gods whose whims and favor dictated the fates of cities, harvests, and even individual lives. To understand Mesopotamian religion is to glimpse into the soul of a people who saw the divine in every gust of wind, in every bolt of lightning, and in the very bricks that formed their sacred towers. At the heart of this relationship between humans and gods stood the ziggurat, a monumental structure that was much more than just an architectural feat. It was a ladder between earth and the heavens, a physical and spiritual axis connecting mortals to their deities. Ziggurats were massive terraced structures, constructed with mud bricks that rose like mountains above the flat Mesopotamian plains. Unlike the Egyptian pyramids, which served as tombs, ziggurats were temples dedicated to the gods, meant not for human burial, but for divine habitation. Atop each ziggurat sat a temple or shrine believed to be the earthly home of the god to whom the structure was dedicated. These towering edifices were often the focal point of city-states, reflecting both the religious devotion and the social organization of the time. In cities such as Eridu, and Babylon, the ziggurat was a central feature, a visual reminder that the divine was ever present and that human life revolved around maintaining cosmic order through worship. The gods of Mesopotamia were numerous, each embodying natural forces, celestial bodies, and abstract principles. From Anu, the sky god, to Enlil, the lord of the winds, and from Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, to Ea, the god of wisdom and freshwater, the pantheon was rich and complex. Each city-state typically had a patron deity, and the people believed that their survival and prosperity depended on the favor of that deity. This divine favoritism was not taken for granted. It had to be earned through rituals, sacrifices, prayers, and offerings. Ziggurats, therefore, were not just symbolic structures. They were stages for maintaining the bond between the human and divine realms. Religious rituals in Mesopotamia were intricate and solemn. Priests played a vital role as intermediaries between the gods and the people. These priests conducted daily offerings, performed elaborate ceremonies during festivals, and interpreted omens and dreams, which were believed to be messages from the divine. Every ritual act had a purpose, whether to appease an angry god, to secure victory in war, or to ensure agricultural abundance. Mesopotamians believed the gods were deeply involved in every aspect of life, but were also temperamental. Divine wrath could bring floods, famine, or conquest, and so the people lived in a constant state of spiritual vigilance. One of the most iconic ziggurats was the Great Ziggurat of dedicated to the moon god Nana. Built by King Namu around 2100 BCE, this grand structure reflected both religious devotion and royal authority. Kings in Mesopotamia were not gods themselves, as in Egypt, but they were divinely chosen stewards. Their duty was to uphold the will of the gods, ensure proper worship, and maintain order. Building or restoring a ziggurat was seen as a king's sacred obligation, a testament to his piety and legitimacy. The construction of these temples was believed to secure divine protection for the city and its people. The physical act of ascending the ziggurat steps had profound religious symbolism. It represented a journey from the mundane to the sacred, from the chaos of human life to the order of the divine cosmos. The temple at the summit was often decorated with precious metals and ceremonial objects, creating an awe-inspiring space believed to be occupied by the god. Only priests and kings were allowed to enter these holy precincts, where they offered food, drink, and incense to the deity. The belief was that these offerings sustained the gods, who in turn blessed the people with health, fertility, and victory. Beyond the ziggurats, the Mesopotamian religious landscape included smaller temples, household shrines, and sacred precincts. Religion permeated all levels of society. Families maintained idols of household gods and ancestors, performing daily rituals to secure protection and favor. Festivals such as the Akitu, the New Year celebration, reinforced the cosmic order and reaffirmed the bond between gods and mortals. These festivals were marked by grand processions, ritual reenactments of creation myths, and the reaffirmation of the king's role as the divine agent on earth. Mesopotamian mythology offered rich narratives that explained the origins of the world, the roles of the gods, and the fate of humankind. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, tells the story of how the god Marduk defeated the chaos monster Tiamat and created the world from her body. In doing so, he established himself as the king of the gods, and humans were created to serve them, to ease their burdens by offering labor and devotion. This myth encapsulates the Mesopotamian worldview. The universe is born from struggle. The gods are powerful but require human service, and order must be actively maintained through ritual and obedience. In this cosmic arrangement, human beings were not central figures, but rather necessary participants in the divine scheme. Life was often harsh, and misfortune was interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure. As such, Mesopotamians practiced various forms of divination to understand the god's will. Observing the stars, examining animal entrails, interpreting dreams. These were all methods employed to read the divine signs scattered across the world. Every element of the environment was a potential message from the gods, and decoding these messages was essential for making decisions in politics, agriculture, and personal life. Despite the fearsome power of the gods, there was also a sense of reciprocity. If the people upheld their rituals and offered proper respect, the gods would bless them. Temples were centers of not just worship, but also economic and social life. They owned land, employed workers, managed granaries, and acted as centers of learning. Some of the earliest forms of writing, like Cuneiform, were developed in temple contexts for keeping records of offerings, transactions, and religious texts. Religion and literacy were intertwined, and priests were among the most educated members of society. Over time, as empires rose and fell, the pantheon evolved, absorbing new deities and practices. With the ascendancy of Babylon, the god Marduk gained prominence, eventually being seen as the supreme deity. This shift was reflected in temple construction and religious literature, which began to emphasize Marduk's power and benevolence. Yet, even as different gods came to the forefront, the ziggurat remained a constant, a symbol of continuity and divine presence in an ever-changing world. Ziggurats were not merely relics of a bygone era. They were embodiments of a living faith. Their construction required enormous collective effort, drawing together architects, laborers, artisans, and priests. The very act of building them was an act of devotion. In a landscape vulnerable to natural disasters and political upheaval, the permanence of these structures served as a testament to the enduring bond between the people and their gods. Their towering forms pierced the sky, proclaiming that the gods watched over the land and that through worship, humans could find order, meaning, and connection to the divine. Though the ziggurats now stand in ruin, their legacy endures. They remind us of a time when spirituality shaped the very structure of cities, when divine favor was sought through monumental labor and unwavering devotion. They speak of a worldview in which the sacred was not confined to hidden temples, but was elevated, literally, into the sky for all to see. In the grand stairways that once rose toward the heavens, we see the aspirations of a civilization reaching beyond the earthly realm, seeking guidance, protection, and communion with forces greater than themselves. In the shadow of the ziggurat, we glimpse the heart of Mesopotamian religion, a relationship of awe, dependence, and enduring reverence for the gods who walked among the people, shaping their destinies one brick at a time. The enduring influence of Mesopotamian religion can be seen not just in its ziggurats and myths, but in the structure of how ancient societies conceived of time, fate, and the role of humans in the cosmos. For the Mesopotamians, the gods were not distant creators who had set the universe in motion and stepped away. They were ever present, demanding constant attention, reverence, and sacrifice. This created a worldview in which the sacred permeated every level of existence, from the alignment of stars to the laying of a city's foundation stone. Every decision of importance, from royal decrees to agricultural planting schedules, was first passed through the lens of divination, rituals, and priestly consultation. The will of the gods was not optional, it was law, and ignoring it meant courting chaos. One of the more striking elements of Mesopotamian religion was the way it codified its divine-human relationships in ritual drama. In temple ceremonies, especially during key festivals like the Akitu, priests would reenact creation myths, play the parts of gods, and symbolically re-establish cosmic order through ritual performance. The king himself would often be stripped of his regalia, humiliated temporarily before being ritually recrowned and reaffirmed by the gods. This dramatization was not symbolic in the modern theatrical sense. It was believed to be a direct restabilization of the universe. The gods did not merely watch these rituals, they were thought to inhabit them, experiencing them anew each year. The divine was not a passive observer, but an active participant in the drama of earthly life. Priesthood in Mesopotamia was not a casual vocation, but a highly specialized and revered position. Priests and priestesses were chosen from noble families and trained extensively in ritual practices, astrology, dream interpretation, and sacred texts. Some temples even had their own schools, edabas, where scribes learned cuneiform writing, mathematics, and religious hymns. These temples operated as both spiritual centers and administrative hubs, keeping track of food distribution, livestock counts, and temple incomes. The ziggurat complex, therefore, was not only a symbol of spiritual power, but also a nerve center of economic and intellectual life. Each deity in the Mesopotamian pantheon had specific symbols, animals, numbers, and planetary associations. For example, the sun god Shamash was symbolized by the solar disk and linked to justice, clarity, and truth. The god Ea was associated with freshwater and wisdom, and his domain was the abyss beneath the earth known as the Apsu. The goddess Ishtar, both revered and feared, represented love, fertility, war, and political power. Her temple rituals were some of the most elaborate, often involving sacred marriage ceremonies, music, and dance. The interweaving of mythology, ritual, and iconography made every aspect of Mesopotamian life a reflection of the divine order. Another fascinating dimension of Mesopotamian belief was the underworld, the land of the dead, known as Kur. Unlike later religious traditions that often promised a blissful afterlife for the righteous, Mesopotamian afterlife beliefs were somber and grim. The dead resided in a shadowy, dust-filled realm beneath the earth, regardless of their deeds in life. Offerings were made to the dead to ease their suffering, and neglecting one's ancestors could bring misfortune to the living. Death was not seen as a reward or punishment, but as a continuation of existence under far bleaker circumstances. The focus, therefore, remained on this life, on appeasing the gods, sustaining the community, and maintaining order. The relationship between rulers and religion was deeply interdependent. Kings built temples not only as acts of piety, but also to legitimize their rule. Inscriptions on temple foundations often claimed divine mandate, stating that the god had called the king to build the ziggurat or restore the sanctuary. These statements were not just propaganda, they were theological affirmations of cosmic order. If a king succeeded in building or maintaining a magnificent temple, it was proof that he enjoyed the god's favor. Conversely, if a ziggurat fell into disrepair or was desecrated, it was taken as a sign that the city, and perhaps the king, had lost divine approval. Some temples became pilgrimage sites, drawing people from distant regions. Pilgrims would bring offerings, seek divine judgment in disputes, or pray for healing. Temples thus served not just their cities, but the broader network of Mesopotamian civilization. This also facilitated a kind of religious standardization, where certain gods like Marduk or Ishtar gained supra-local status, becoming central figures in a broader cultural identity. In this way, ziggurats were not only civic symbols, but beacons of shared spiritual belief. Despite its rich polytheistic framework, Mesopotamian religion was surprisingly flexible and adaptive. As empires expanded and contracted, new gods were added to the pantheon, often by integrating or reinterpreting foreign deities. This syncretism helped Mesopotamian culture absorb and influence surrounding civilizations, from the Hittites and Elamites to the later Assyrians and Persians. Even the Hebrew Bible, emerging from the same region, bears the imprint of Mesopotamian cosmology, myth, and law. Echoes of the flood narrative from the Epic of Gilgamesh can be seen in the story of Noah. With the passage of time, the great ziggurats began to crumble. Earthquakes, floods, and wars took their toll. New empires rose, Persian, Greek, Roman, and with them came new religions that would eventually replace the old ways. Yet, the spiritual DNA of Mesopotamian religion lived on. Concepts of divine justice, the sacredness of ritual, the intertwining of heaven and earth through built structures, all of these would echo through later religious traditions, including Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The very idea of building upward toward the divine found new expressions in church spires, minarets, and temples across the ancient world. Today, archaeological remnants of ziggurats like those in Ur and Dur-Kurgalzu stand as weathered monuments to a vanished age. Their stepped forms, once glowing with glazed bricks and ringing with ritual chants, now rest in silence beneath the desert sky. Yet even in ruin, they speak volumes. They whisper of a people who sought meaning in the stars, who believed that divine order could be shaped by human hands, and who raised entire cities around their devotion to the gods. The ziggurat, in its grandeur and symbolism, remains a testament to the deep spiritual hunger that has driven civilizations to build, worship, and wonder. To walk among the remains of a ziggurat today is to step into the spiritual footprint of the world's first cities. It is to imagine the clang of bronze ritual instruments, the scent of burning incense drifting upward, and the solemn processions of priests ascending the holy steps. It is to feel, even faintly, the enduring awe that the Mesopotamians must have felt as they gazed upward, toward gods who dwelled in the sky and towers built by hands that dared to touch the heavens. The legacy of Mesopotamian religion endures not just in stone, but in the very foundations of how humanity has understood the sacred, the divine, and its place in the universe. The invention of the wheel and urban planning. The invention of the wheel stands as one of humanity's most profound technological achievements, a breakthrough so fundamental that it not only changed transportation forever, but also influenced the very structure of cities and societies. Long before sleek cars glided across modern highways or trains connected cities across continents, the humble wheel began as a simple solution to a deeply human problem: how to move things more easily. But the wheel was never just about movement. It was a catalyst for imagination, for planning, and for rethinking how humans organize themselves spatially and economically. As soon as it emerged, it began reshaping landscapes, economies, and the physical makeup of our earliest cities. To understand urban planning in ancient times, we must first grasp the silent revolution ignited by that simple circular innovation. Historians generally agree that the first wheel was not developed for transportation at all, but as a potter's tool used to shape clay. The earliest known wheel dates back to around 3500 BCE in Mesopotamia, a region that would later be heralded as the cradle of civilization. In this early form, the wheel served as part of the potter's wheel, an innovation that improved efficiency in crafting containers essential for storage and trade. It wasn't until several hundred years later, around 300 years later, that the wheel was adapted for transportation. Even then, the complexity of attaching a rotating wheel to a stable axle made it an engineering challenge that required not only creativity, but a new way of thinking about mechanical motion. Once this challenge was overcome, the wheel began transforming life across early civilizations. No longer bound by the brute force of dragging goods across the land, humans could now transport heavier loads with significantly less effort. Carts, wagons, and eventually chariots became the new standard of mobility. This increased efficiency didn't just make life easier, it expanded trade routes, encouraged exploration, and contributed to the first long-distance economies. Cities that once struggled to connect with far-flung regions were suddenly part of a network, capable of exchanging resources, ideas, and technologies. This shift in mobility sparked a broader transformation: urban planning. With the ability to transport not just goods but also building materials, cities no longer had to rely solely on nearby resources. Stone, timber, and clay could be brought in from distant regions, allowing for more ambitious architectural designs. This mobility enabled the expansion of cities both outward and upward, encouraging planners to think more strategically about layout and infrastructure. One of the most fascinating effects of the wheel on urban design was the emergence of road systems. Before wheels, paths were irregular, dictated by terrain and foot traffic, but wheeled transport demanded smoother, more consistent surfaces. The result was the world's earliest road networks, designed to accommodate carts and wagons. These roads needed to be flat, durable, and strategically placed, laying the groundwork for the grid patterns and logical layouts that many modern cities still follow today. In ancient Mesopotamia, road systems became integral to city planning, connecting administrative centers, markets, temples, and residential areas in a coordinated flow. As roads developed, so did the importance of intersections and hubs, which gave birth to the concept of centralized marketplaces. These were not just places to trade goods, but melting pots where ideas and cultures met. The movement enabled by wheels allowed people from different regions to gather regularly, fostering economic activity and cultural exchange. The cities themselves became more diverse and dynamic, shaped by the continuous flow of people and products. Wheeled transport also had a direct influence on military logistics. Armies could now move faster and more efficiently, which in turn affected how cities were fortified and defended. Urban planners had to consider the movement of chariots and supply carts when designing gates, walls, and pathways. This new mobility reshaped the scale and reach of military power, but it also meant that cities could grow more confidently, supported by the knowledge that they could be defended or reinforced rapidly. As wheels became more commonplace, their influence extended into agricultural planning. Farmers could transport their harvests to urban centers more efficiently, enabling cities to support larger populations. Urban areas, in turn, began developing centralized storage facilities, granaries, and distribution points. This shift required meticulous organization and foresight, early examples of logistical urban planning. Cities began to develop sectors and zones, industrial areas for pottery and metalwork, residential quarters, administrative districts, and temples, all woven together by networks of wheel-friendly roads. This evolution marked a pivotal transition from organic, unstructured settlements to intentional, structured urban environments. It's not an exaggeration to say that the wheel catalyzed the transformation of the village into the city. It encouraged a spatial logic that has endured for millennia. From the ziggurat cities of Mesopotamia to the later Roman Empire with its vast, straight roads, the imprint of the wheel is unmistakable. Yet the wheel was not just a mechanical device. It was a symbol of a new era. It embodied progress, rotation, and cycles, a metaphor as much as a machine. As urban centers grew more complex, so too did the technologies and ideas that sprang from them. The wheel inspired other rotating mechanisms like gears, pulleys, and mills, each of which played a critical role in further urban development. Water wheels, for instance, enabled the irrigation of larger fields and the mechanization of grain grinding, allowing cities to support even more people and to plan for sustained growth. It's worth noting that the wheel was not universally adopted at the same time or in the same way across different civilizations. In some areas, the terrain made wheeled transport less practical, but even where its physical application was limited, the concept of the wheel, of rotational energy, of mechanical advantage, influenced other areas of innovation. The idea of circular motion became central in timekeeping, astronomy, and even governance, as societies began thinking in terms of recurring cycles, harvests, seasons, dynasties, and urban renewal. The philosophical implications of the wheel began to merge with its practical uses. Many early religious and cosmological systems saw the wheel as a divine symbol. In Hinduism and Buddhism, for example, the wheel represents the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. The same can be said of many Mesopotamian and later Greco-Roman traditions, where the wheel often stood for fate or celestial motion. Urban planning, too, started to mirror this cyclical thinking, with cities being designed around central temples or ziggurats, symbolic axes around which life revolved. What's remarkable is how deeply the invention of the wheel continues to echo in the present day. Modern urban planning is built upon principles that were first made necessary by the wheel: mobility, zoning, logistics, and infrastructure. Cities today may buzz with electric cars and subways, but the core design considerations remain familiar. We still map cities based on transportation flow, still design roadways to connect key areas, and still rely on networks of movement to sustain the beating heart of urban life. Looking back, it's almost poetic that such a simple shape, a circle, would set into motion such a complex evolution of human society. The wheel enabled us to think beyond the immediate, to reach further, to connect with others, and to build not just for the moment, but for the future. Urban planning was never just about walls, streets, or buildings. It was about vision. And the wheel, rolling forward through time, helped guide that vision from the dusty plains of Mesopotamia to the gleaming skylines of today. As we continue to face modern urban challenges, climate change, population growth, sustainability, it's worth remembering the humble wheel and what it made possible. It wasn't just a tool of motion, but a spark of transformation. It turned labor into leverage, distance into opportunity, and chaos into design. In many ways, it continues to turn, quietly and steadily, Cradle, beneath every city we build. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's first story. Long before the rise of Homer's Iliad or the biblical tales of Genesis, a story emerged from the land between the rivers, a tale so old and yet so timeless that it continues to resonate with us today. That story is the Epic of Gilgamesh, often considered the world's first great literary work. Carved into clay tablets over 4,000 years ago, it captures not just the life of a king, but the very soul of ancient Mesopotamian civilization. Set in the great city of Uruk, one of the earliest and most vibrant urban centers in human history, the epic chronicles the journey of Gilgamesh, a historical figure who reigned as a king, but whose deeds became the stuff of legend. At the beginning of the epic, Gilgamesh is no hero in the traditional sense. He is powerful, arrogant, and tyrannical. 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, he rules with an iron fist, his unmatched strength both a blessing and a curse to his people. The citizens of Uruk, weary of his oppressive rule and excessive pride, cry out to the gods for relief. The gods respond by creating a counterpart to Gilgamesh, a wild man named Enkidu, formed from clay and raised among animals, untouched by civilization. Enkidu represents the raw, untamed forces of nature, living in harmony with the wild until he is lured to the world of humans by a temple prostitute, Shamhat. Through her, Enkidu becomes civilized, losing his innocence but gaining awareness. When Gilgamesh and Enkidu finally meet, they clash in a brutal contest of strength that shakes the very foundations of Uruk. Neither emerges victorious, and in their stalemate, a profound respect is born. From fierce adversaries, they become inseparable friends, bound by a sense of mutual admiration and shared purpose. Their friendship marks a turning point in the epic. Gilgamesh, once a reckless ruler, begins to seek meaning beyond conquest and domination. Driven by a desire for eternal glory, the two embark on a perilous adventure to slay Humbaba, the monstrous guardian of the cedar forest. The forest, sacred to the gods, is no ordinary place. It is a realm of beauty and terror, ruled by divine law. Despite warnings and omens, Gilgamesh and Enkidu confront Humbaba. With courage and cunning, they defeat the beast, an act that brings them fame but also divine displeasure. The gods, angered by their defiance and hubris, begin to weave a darker fate. Their return to Uruk is triumphant, but Gilgamesh's growing fame draws the attention of the goddess Ishtar, who proposes marriage to him. Gilgamesh spurns her, citing the fates of her many former lovers. Enraged, Ishtar appeals to the gods, and they send the Bull of Heaven to punish Gilgamesh and his city. Once again, Gilgamesh and Enkidu fight side by side, defeating the celestial beast in a spectacular display of strength and unity. But this time there is a price. The gods decree that one of the two must die for their transgressions. They choose Enkidu. His death is slow and agonizing, filled with bitterness and regret. As Enkidu fades, he curses the world and laments the life he gave up for friendship. Gilgamesh is devastated. The death of his closest companion is more than a personal loss, it is an awakening. For the first time, the great king confronts the inevitability of death, not as an abstract fate for others, but as a destiny that awaits even the mighty. This grief becomes the catalyst for the second half of the epic, Gilgamesh's search for immortality. Haunted by visions of his own mortality, Gilgamesh sets out on a lonely quest to find Utnapishtim, a man granted eternal life by the gods after surviving a great flood that destroyed humanity. Utnapishtim's story bears a striking resemblance to the later biblical tale of Noah, complete with a divine warning, an ark, and the saving of life from a catastrophic deluge. When Gilgamesh finds him at the edge of the world, he demands to know the secret to immortality, but Utnapishtim offers no easy answers. He tells Gilgamesh that death is woven into the fabric of existence and that striving to escape it is futile. Still, he offers a small hope, a magical plant that can restore youth. Gilgamesh retrieves the plant, believing he has conquered death, but while bathing, a serpent steals it away. Defeated and exhausted, Gilgamesh returns to Uruk, empty-handed but transformed. In the final lines of the epic, Gilgamesh stands atop the walls of his city, no longer the arrogant king of old, but a man who has looked into the abyss and returned with wisdom. He points to the great stones of Uruk, proud of the civilization he helped shape. While he has not gained immortality, he understands now that the legacy of one's deeds, the stories we leave behind, are a form of eternal life. It is not through defying death, but through building, creating, and caring that humans achieve a measure of eternity. The Epic of Gilgamesh is far more than a myth from a forgotten age. It is a mirror held up to the human condition, our dreams, fears, pride, and sorrows. It speaks of friendship and loss, of hubris and humility, of the restless quest for meaning in the face of mortality. And though it comes from a time when writing itself was still new, its voice remains startlingly modern. It shows us that even in ancient Mesopotamia, people wrestled with the same questions we ask today. What does it mean to live a good life? How do we face death? What is the value of companionship? What legacy do we leave behind? As one of the oldest literary works known to us, the Epic of Gilgamesh forms a foundational pillar of world literature. It offers a rare glimpse into the worldview of early civilization, revealing how the Mesopotamians understood gods, fate, and the human role in the cosmos. Their gods are powerful, often arbitrary, and prone to the same emotional extremes as mortals. Their heroes are complex, capable of both great compassion and terrible wrath, and their stories, while filled with supernatural elements, are rooted in very human struggles. There is also a certain irony in the way Gilgamesh's tale survived the ages. Written on fragile clay tablets in cuneiform, the story was buried, lost for millennia, only to be rediscovered in the 19th century among the ruins of Nineveh. It took scholars decades to piece it together, and even today, some fragments are missing. Yet what remains is more than enough to convey its emotional and philosophical power. The survival of this ancient tale through war, destruction, and time itself echoes the very theme it seeks to explore: the impermanence of life and the strange durability of legacy. Modern readers and audiences continue to find relevance in Gilgamesh's journey. From literature and film to psychology and theology, the epic's influence is wide and deep. It has inspired poets, philosophers, and storytellers across cultures and centuries. Carl Jung saw in Gilgamesh the archetypal hero's journey, a framework that would later shape how we understand myths and personal transformation. Others find in it a reflection of ecological themes, as the destruction of the cedar forest symbolizes humankind's destructive relationship with nature. Still others read it as an early meditation on grief, trauma, and recovery. In many ways, the Epic of Gilgamesh is the first attempt at answering some of the most pressing existential questions. Why do we die? What is the meaning of suffering? How should we live knowing that nothing lasts forever? That such questions were being asked thousands of years ago by people who lived in a world of clay bricks, ziggurats, and chariots speaks to the continuity of the human spirit. Technology may have changed, but the longings and anxieties that animate our hearts remain much the same. So when we speak of the Epic of Gilgamesh as the world's first story, We are not just referring to its chronological place in literary history. We are honoring its power to express what it means to be human. It is a story that has crossed the boundaries of time, language, and culture to reach us, still breathing, still resonant, still whispering truths from the dawn of civilization. It reminds us that though empires crumble and kings fall, stories endure. And through stories, so do we. The Sumerian Kings List and Dynastic Power. The Sumerian Kings List stands as one of the most enigmatic and fascinating documents from ancient Mesopotamia. Inscribed on clay tablets in cuneiform script, this text does not merely function as a chronological record of kings. It weaves together myth, legend, and historical memory into a unified vision of dynastic power and divine legitimacy. As the voiceover begins, one is drawn into a world where history and mythology are blurred, where gods walked among men, and where rulers reigned for thousands of years. This extraordinary list, originating from the ancient city of Sumer, is both a tool of political authority and a window into the ideological structure of early Mesopotamian civilization. The King's List begins with the phrase, "after the kingship descended from heaven," immediately signaling that royal authority was not seen as a product of human society, but as a divine institution. Kingship was believed to be bestowed by the gods themselves, handed down from the heavens to earth, and entrusted to select city-states one after the other. The list then proceeds to name the early antediluvian kings, those who ruled before the Great Flood. These rulers are said to have reigned for impossibly long periods, some for tens of thousands of years. For example, Alulim of Eridu is listed as reigning for 28,800 years, and Enmenluana of Bad Tabira for 43,200 years. These staggering figures are not meant to be taken literally, but symbolically, reflecting the sacred and mythic nature of kingship in the primordial era. Such durations evoke a timeless golden age, a period closer to the divine realm when humans still enjoyed a closer connection with the gods. But then, the flood comes, a cataclysmic event that wipes out this ancient world and marks a clear division between myth and the beginnings of recorded history. After the flood, the list resumes with kings who ruled in shorter, more plausible terms, shifting from myth to semi-historical memory. This post-Diluvian period introduces dynasties in cities like Kish, Uruk, and Lagash, among others. These entries are more grounded, though still interspersed with rulers whose deeds seem legendary. The structure of the list suggests that kingship was not bound to a particular bloodline or geographic center, but transferred from city to city, likely reflecting periods of conquest, alliance, or shifts in political influence. The King's List is also notable for what it omits. Many powerful dynasties and rulers known from archaeology and other texts are conspicuously absent. For instance, the powerful kings of Lagash are not included, perhaps because they did not align with the narrative being constructed. The list seems more interested in establishing a perceived continuity of legitimate rule than in strict historical accuracy. It may have been composed or edited with political motives to legitimize a current regime by showing it as the inheritor of a divinely sanctioned tradition. In doing so, the text becomes a tool of propaganda, anchoring the present in an unbroken chain stretching back to the origins of time. Throughout the list, dynastic power is portrayed as transient yet divinely ordained. A city may hold the kingship for generations, only to lose it and see the power pass elsewhere. This transference is never described as a result of human error or rebellion, but is always framed as part of a cosmic order. When the kingship falls from one city and is taken by another, it reflects not human weakness, but divine will. This reinforces the idea that Mesopotamian political thought was deeply fatalistic. The gods determined the fate of cities and kings, and human beings were merely actors in a script written by divine hands. Such a worldview served to justify the rise and fall of dynasties and ensured that even in defeat, a city's memory could be preserved in the sacred ledger of kings. One of the most prominent figures in the list is Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, who is also the hero of the world's earliest known epic. Though Gilgamesh's deeds are shrouded in myth, his presence on the list suggests that some memory of his rule was preserved and venerated. He bridges the worlds of myth and history, illustrating how Sumerians did not see a strict boundary between the two. To them, A king could be both a historical figure and a mythic archetype, mortal and godlike at once. The King's List enshrines this duality, celebrating rulers not just for their deeds, but for their symbolic importance within the cosmic order. Over time, copies of the King's List have been found in different cities and periods, including a particularly well-preserved version from the city of Larsa. These versions contain slight variations, indicating that the list was continually revised and updated. This process of revision reflects the fluid nature of memory and history in Mesopotamia. It shows how each city-state might interpret the past through the lens of its own political needs. By inscribing their version of history onto clay, Sumerian scribes were also inscribing legitimacy, claiming that their rule was part of an unbroken divine tradition. It's important to understand the King's List not as a literal timeline, but as a narrative of legitimacy. It is as much about divine favor and political ideology as it is about chronology. Each entry serves to link the present to the sacred past, to show that the current king is not merely a ruler, but the latest vessel of divine kingship. The gods chose him as they once chose Alulim, Gilgamesh, and others. In this way, the list becomes a kind of sacred genealogy, not of blood, but of power and favor. This dynastic consciousness shaped the political identity of Sumerian civilization. City-states constantly vied not just for territory or wealth, but for the honor of holding the kingship. Control of the kingship meant more than governance. It meant being the chosen representative of divine will on earth. A king's legitimacy came not merely from conquest, but from his alignment with a cosmic tradition stretching back millennia. To lose the kingship was to fall out of divine favor. To gain it was to rise to the very center of the world. The impact of the King's List echoes through later Mesopotamian cultures. The Babylonians and Assyrians inherited the tradition, using similar lists to legitimize their own rule. These successors saw themselves as the continuers of Sumerian legacy, extending the divine mandate through time. The King's List thus forms part of a much larger tradition of viewing history as a divine drama, one in which human rulers are temporary stewards of eternal power. It also serves as a remarkable cultural document. It shows us how the Sumerians viewed time, authority, and destiny. To them, history was not a random sequence of events, but a patterned movement governed by divine forces. Their kings were not merely administrators, but sacred figures whose reigns echoed the will of the gods. And through this understanding, they created a civilization that valued order, tradition, and continuity above all. In modern times, the Sumerian King's List remains an essential text for historians and archaeologists. It gives us clues about the political landscape of early Mesopotamia, hints at lost dynasties and cities, and offers insight into how the Sumerians understood their place in the universe. But perhaps more than anything, it reveals a civilization deeply concerned with legitimacy, cosmic order, and the sacred dimensions of rulership. It reminds us that power in ancient Sumer was never just political, it was divine. As the voiceover fades out, the listener is left with a sense of awe at the ambition and depth of Sumerian thought. The King's List is not just a relic of the past, it is a voice from the dawn of civilization, whispering through the ages that true power lies not only in conquest, but in the story one tells of how the world began and who was chosen to lead it. The mythic kings may be long gone, but their legacy, etched in clay and preserved in memory, still speaks. The Akkadian Empire and Sargon the Great. In the dust-laden heart of ancient Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates carved fertile paths through barren land, a seismic shift occurred in the tapestry of human history. This shift was not a natural disaster, nor a divine intervention, but rather the product of human ambition, of one man's will to dominate, unify, and redefine what it meant to rule. His name was Sargon, known to history as Sargon the Great, and his legacy would echo through millennia as the founder of the world's first recorded empire, the Akkadian Empire. Before Sargon, Mesopotamia was a checkerboard of independent city-states, each with its own god, ruler, language, and laws, engaged in a constant dance of diplomacy, war, and trade. These city-states, such as Ur, Uruk, Lagash, and Kish, had flourished in the Sumerian heartland, giving rise to early innovations in writing, law, and urban governance. Yet, their constant rivalries also made the region vulnerable to a figure of unrelenting ambition. Sargon's origins are as mysterious as they are legendary. According to myth and fragmented inscriptions, he was born of humble means, placed as an infant in a basket, and set adrift on the river, echoing a motif that would later find resonance in other ancient narratives. Rescued and raised by a gardener in the service of the king of Kish, Sargon's rise was improbable, if not miraculous. But rise he did, eventually becoming the cupbearer to Baba, the king of Kish, a role that offered both proximity to power and an opportunity to learn the intricacies of administration and military command. Sargon seized his moment with cunning and force, overthrowing Baba and launching a campaign that would see him conquer the major Sumerian cities and extend his dominion far beyond the bounds of tradition. The unification of these diverse and often warring city-states under a single banner was unprecedented. Sargon, instead of merely ruling from Kish or Uruk, established a new political center, Akkad or Agade, whose exact location remains lost to history, but whose cultural and political influence became legendary. In doing so, Sargon laid the foundation for a centralized bureaucracy that would become a model for later empires. His reign was not simply an accumulation of cities and peoples, but an ambitious reimagining of what kingship could be. Where previous rulers claimed dominion over individual cities or regions, Sargon declared himself King of the Four Quarters of the World, a bold title that suggested universal rule and divine favor. Sargon's military campaigns were vast and brutal, stretching from the Persian Gulf in the south to the Taurus Mountains in the north and as far west as the Mediterranean Sea. He implemented a standing army, professionalized and loyal not to city-states but to the empire itself. This innovation allowed for rapid deployment and sustained control over distant territories. Through a combination of military conquest, strategic marriages, and diplomatic alliances, he integrated a mosaic of cultures and languages under the Akkadian umbrella. Akkadian, a Semitic language distinct from the Sumerian tongue, became the lingua franca of administration and trade, fostering cohesion among disparate peoples. Cuneiform writing, originally developed by the Sumerians, was adapted to the Akkadian language, ensuring that knowledge, decrees, and culture could be disseminated across the empire's vast expanse. Under Sargon's rule, the concept of divine kingship gained momentum. He was not merely a political leader, but was increasingly seen as chosen by the gods, perhaps even semi-divine himself. Temples were built or restored in his name, and inscriptions lauded his victories as the will of the gods made manifest. This divine association strengthened his grip on power and set a precedent for future rulers who would claim legitimacy through celestial endorsement. Religion and governance became intertwined, as the king stood as both a temporal and spiritual shepherd. The Ziggurats, towering temple complexes, dotted the landscape, serving as both religious centers and symbols of imperial power. In these acts, Sargon transformed kingship from a civic duty into a cosmic mandate. Sargon also initiated reforms to solidify his control. He appointed governors, often his own trusted family members, to oversee the provinces. These officials collected taxes, maintained order, and ensured the flow of goods and tribute back to the imperial center. He standardized weights and measures, established road systems, and maintained a complex network of communication to bind the empire's vast territories together. These innovations were not merely administrative. They reflected a new ideology of unity, a belief that disparate peoples could be brought together under a single overarching authority. Yet, as with all empires, the Akkadian reign was not without challenges. The logistics of maintaining control over such an expansive territory strained resources and required constant military readiness. Rebellions flared periodically, particularly in the southern cities of Sumer, where memories of independence lingered, and loyalty to local deities remained strong. Sargon often found himself returning to these regions to quell uprisings, asserting again and again the might of the central authority. Natural disasters, including severe droughts and changing river courses, compounded these problems, stressing agriculture and undermining economic stability. Still, the empire endured through sheer will, administrative prowess, and a legacy that resonated long after Sargon's death. Sargon ruled for over 5 decades, and upon his death, his empire passed to his sons and later his grandson, Naram-Sin, who would expand upon Sargon's vision and declare himself a god. This continuation of dynastic rule suggests that Sargon not only established an empire, but also a model of hereditary succession and divine kingship that would become standard in the ancient Near East. Naram-Sin's own exploits, including the famed victory stele, which depicts him towering over his enemies beneath a celestial canopy, show the enduring influence of Sargon's innovations in art, symbolism, and royal ideology. The Akkadian Empire reached its zenith under Naram-Sin, but it was already showing signs of strain. Environmental changes, internal dissent, and invasions from nomadic groups like the Gutians eventually destabilized the empire. By the time the Gutians overran Mesopotamia, the Akkadian dream was already beginning to fragment. Yet, the collapse of the Akkadian Empire did not erase its legacy. On the contrary, it laid the groundwork for future empires in the region, including the Babylonians and Assyrians, who would borrow heavily from the administrative and ideological systems pioneered by Sargon. The mythology of Sargon the Great only grew in the centuries following his death. He was remembered as a cultural hero, a unifier, and a conqueror. Kings in later periods sought to emulate him, invoking his name and deeds in their own inscriptions. Even during times of chaos and political fragmentation, the idea of a centralized empire, of a king ruling by divine mandate over a diverse and expansive land, remained alive in the Mesopotamian imagination. Sargon had not merely conquered territory, he had conquered a concept. He had redefined what was possible. In art and literature, Sargon's image was stylized and revered. Clay tablets chronicled his deeds, real and mythic. His legend was transmitted through epic tales and king lists, solidifying his place not just in political history, but in cultural memory. Akkadian became a language of scholarship, diplomacy, and record-keeping for over 1,000 years, testament to the lasting influence of Sargon's linguistic and bureaucratic reforms. Even as the empire faded, its heartbeat could still be felt in the rhythms of Mesopotamian civilization. The ruins of Akkad may never be found, buried perhaps beneath layers of earth and time, but its legacy is etched into the DNA of human governance. The idea that a single ruler could unite a fractured world, impose order on chaos, and wield power through both divine sanction and administrative brilliance began with Sargon. His reign marks the threshold where myth meets history, where the ambitions of one man reshaped the destiny of a region and set the tone for empire building across continents. In reflecting upon Sargon the Great and the Akkadian Empire, we encounter not just an early chapter in the story of civilization, but a blueprint, imperfect, fragile, yet visionary, for all who would rule in his wake. His vision of unity through conquest, law, language, and culture remains one of the most transformative in all of human history. From the reeds of the river where his journey began to the sprawling empire he forged, Sargon stands as a testament to what boldness, innovation, and sheer determination can achieve. He was not merely a king, he was a revolution in the idea of kingship itself. Even centuries after the Akkadian Empire crumbled under the weight of internal strife and external pressures, its foundational principles remained embedded in the soul of Mesopotamia. The idea of centralized authority, of governance by decree rather than by consensus among cities, lived on through later civilizations. Babylonian and Assyrian rulers did not just inherit the geographical lands that once belonged to Sargon, they inherited a philosophy of empire, one that prized order, communication, and divine authority. The inscriptions left behind by these later kings often referenced Sargon with admiration, portraying him not as a figure of the past, but as a timeless archetype of imperial success. Archaeological evidence continues to unearth fragments of Akkadian life. Tablets, seal impressions, administrative records, and art, all of which paint a vivid picture of an organized, stratified society that placed enormous value on structure and control. Cities were not merely clusters of buildings, they were nodes in a network carefully woven together by a system of roads and messengers. The Akkadians may not have called it infrastructure in the modern sense, but their empire functioned as one of the first truly interlinked civilizations. With roads stretching from Sumer in the south to the Anatolian Plateau in the north, the empire allowed ideas, goods, and orders to travel swiftly, an early experiment in global connectivity. Culturally, the Akkadians contributed more than bureaucracy and conquest. Their synthesis of Sumerian religion and Semitic traditions gave rise to a uniquely hybrid cultural identity. Rather than erase Sumerian deities, the Akkadians adopted and integrated them, building on existing myths and religious practices to solidify their legitimacy among the southern populations. Gods like Enlil, Inanna, and Anu continued to be venerated, but were also joined by Semitic deities such as Shamash and Ishtar. This blending of pantheons helped create a spiritual continuity that reassured subjects across the empire that their traditions were respected, even as their governance changed hands. This cultural merger also extended into literature and myth. One of the most enduring Akkadian contributions to world heritage is the expansion of narrative storytelling. Later epics, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, while rooted in Sumerian origin, were preserved, expanded, and popularized in the Akkadian language. These tales, rich in existential questions and divine encounters, laid the groundwork for future civilizations' literary and moral frameworks. They offered not just entertainment, but ethical and philosophical reflection, as kings, gods, and mortals grappled with themes of power, loss, fate, and the human condition. Economically, the Akkadian Empire was a marvel of coordination. It linked diverse ecosystems, coastal ports, fertile farmlands, mountainous trade routes into a single economic organism. Agricultural surpluses from the southern cities fed northern outposts. Timber from the Zagros Mountains, metals from Anatolia, and luxury items from the Levant flowed into Akkad and were redistributed as gifts or tributes. The concept of imperial economy, wherein wealth was both extracted and reinvested through structured channels, emerged here for the first time. Through meticulous records etched into clay tablets, we find evidence of organized taxation, land surveys, and trade contracts that reveal a sophisticated financial apparatus far ahead of its time. Yet with centralization came fragility. The Akkadian system, while robust in structure, depended heavily on the strength and vision of its rulers. When leadership faltered, the carefully woven web of the empire began to unravel. Climate change played a crucial role in this collapse. A prolonged period of drought, now evidenced through sediment studies and paleoclimatic data, likely devastated agricultural output. Crop failures would have led to famine, unrest, and the weakening of central authority. As regional governors struggled to maintain control, peripheral regions began to splinter, and rival groups, like the Gutians, moved in to claim the void. Still, the collapse was not an end, but a transformation. Even as political control dissolved, the memory of Akkad remained alive in cultural consciousness. The concept of a unifying empire that could bring order to chaos became a recurrent dream in the Mesopotamian world. Each successive regime looked back to Akkad not only as a historical precedent, but as an aspirational ideal. In later centuries, Neo-Assyrian kings like Ashurbanipal and Babylonian leaders like Hammurabi would craft their rule in Sargon's shadow, echoing his titles, his divine associations, and his organizational reforms. In the centuries that followed, the Akkadian language itself persisted, transitioning from a spoken tongue to a language of record, theology, and international diplomacy. It served as the written medium for complex legal codes, royal decrees, astronomical texts, and temple hymns. Even after Aramaic supplanted it as the spoken language of the region, Akkadian remained the sacred language of scribes and scholars, an ancient tongue imbued with power and prestige. This linguistic longevity is another testament to the foundational role Akkad played in shaping intellectual life in the Near East. What also endures from Sargon's empire is the vision of the ruler as more than a mere administrator. In Sargon, we see the emergence of the king as a symbolic figure, the embodiment of divine will, the protector of cosmic order, the stabilizer of society. He was not just a conqueror, he was a cultural architect, shaping everything from myth and ritual to law and urban planning. The ideology of kingship that he cultivated would leave its imprint not only in Mesopotamia, but far beyond, influencing the pharaohs of Egypt, the emperors of Persia, and eventually the rulers of Rome. Today, the legacy of Sargon the Great and the Akkadian Empire invites us to reflect on the recurring themes of human history: ambition and governance, unity and division, innovation and collapse. His story reminds us that empires are not built merely on armies or walls, but on ideas. The idea that people can be brought together, the idea that leadership can transcend local loyalties, and the idea that systems, linguistic, administrative, ideological, can outlive the very empires that created them. In a sense, the ruins of Akkad are not only buried in the soil of Mesopotamia, but also embedded in the architecture of every government, the cadence of every bureaucracy, the symbols of every empire that followed. Sargon's vision of a unified human enterprise, though tested, broken, and remade countless times, remains one of the most powerful legacies in the chronicle of civilization. His empire may be gone, but the echo of Akkad still resonates in our languages, our laws, and the structures of our societies. The fall of Ur, collapse of a Sumerian city. The city of Ur, once the shining jewel of Sumerian civilization, stood as a testament to human ingenuity and the rise of one of history's earliest urban cultures. Nestled along the banks of the Euphrates River in southern Mesopotamia, Ur was a center of religion, trade, and political power. Its towering ziggurat rose high above the landscape, signaling devotion to the moon god Nana, and its storied walls guarded a bustling metropolis filled with scribes, merchants, farmers, and craftsmen. But as with all great cities, Ur's glory did not last forever. The fall of Ur was not the result of a single catastrophic event, but rather a slow, complex unraveling shaped by shifting political alliances, environmental changes, and the relentless tides of time. Ur reached its zenith during the Third Dynasty, known as Ur III, under the reign of powerful kings such as Ur-Nammu and his son Shulgi. These rulers consolidated power, built monumental architecture, codified laws, and established a centralized bureaucracy that stretched across southern Mesopotamia. The empire they forged was remarkable not only for its size, but for its administrative sophistication. Clay tablets discovered in the ruins of Ur reveal an extensive record-keeping system that tracked everything from grain rations to temple expenditures. The economy thrived through agriculture, with vast irrigation networks drawing water from the Euphrates to nourish fields of barley and dates. Trade routes extended to distant regions, bringing in luxury goods and raw materials. Culturally, Ur blossomed, producing art, literature, and innovations that echoed far beyond its borders. However, beneath this golden age simmered the seeds of decline. One of the most persistent threats to Ur's stability was its geography. The region of southern Mesopotamia was flat and open, with few natural barriers to defend against invasions. Moreover, the land depended heavily on irrigation systems that required constant maintenance. As the empire expanded, the resources needed to sustain it grew more strained. And the administration became increasingly rigid, placing heavy burdens on its population through taxes and forced labor. This strain led to growing unrest, especially in the outer provinces, where loyalty to Ur weakened over time. Climate change also played a silent but deadly role in Ur's downfall. Recent geological and environmental studies suggest that a long period of drought struck the region around the end of the 3rd millennium BCE. This 4.2 kiloyear event, as it is known, led to a collapse in agricultural productivity across Mesopotamia. With food supplies dwindling, trade networks disrupted, and internal tensions rising, Ur's once stable society began to fracture. The empire's ability to respond to such crises was hampered by its bureaucratic inflexibility and over-centralization. Farmers abandoned their fields, cities shrank, and migrations increased as people sought more livable conditions elsewhere. Compounding these internal pressures were external threats. One of the most decisive blows to Ur came from the Elamites, a powerful group from the Iranian plateau to the east. In the early 21st century BCE, the Elamites invaded Mesopotamia and sacked the city of Ur. Their assault was brutal and symbolic, a final nail in the coffin of a declining power. The king of Ur at the time, Ibbi-Sin, struggled to rally defenses and maintain control, but his pleas for aid went largely unanswered. His reign ended in humiliation as the city fell and he was likely taken captive. The fall of Ur to the Elamites was a shattering event, not only because of the physical destruction, but because it marked the end of a political and cultural era that had endured for centuries. The lamentation over the fall of Ur was captured in one of the most haunting literary works of the ancient world, the Lament for Ur. This poetic text, written by Sumerian scribes, portrays the city as abandoned by its gods and ravaged by fate. The ziggurat is described as being reduced to rubble, the temples desecrated, and the people scattered. The poem weeps not only for a city, but for the very order and meaning that Ur once embodied. It reveals the deep trauma felt by those who survived the collapse and gives voice to a civilization reckoning with its own mortality. Nana has left his city, the lament says, as if divine favor had been withdrawn and Ur's destruction was inevitable. The text stands as a profound reflection on impermanence, power, and the fragility of human achievement. In the aftermath of Ur's collapse, Mesopotamia entered a period of fragmentation and regional instability. No single power filled the vacuum left by Ur immediately. Smaller city-states jockeyed for control, and for a time, the region lacked the coherence that had characterized the Ur III dynasty. The Elamites themselves did not establish long-term rule over Sumer. Their incursion was more a raid than a full conquest. Eventually, new powers like Essene and Larsa would rise, and later Babylon would assert dominance. But the cohesive vision of empire that Ur had once symbolized was gone. What makes the fall of Ur particularly compelling is not just the story of military defeat or environmental catastrophe, but the way these elements intertwine to bring about the end of a civilization. It was a multifaceted collapse, a product of administrative overreach, ecological stress, economic fragility, and the unpredictability of human ambition. Ur's fall teaches us that even the most advanced societies, with towering architecture and intricate governance, are not immune to failure. The systems we build can be undone by forces beyond our control, and the very complexity that allows civilizations to thrive can also make them more vulnerable to disruption. Yet, even in its fall, Ur left an indelible mark on history. Its contributions to law, literature, urban planning, and religion endured. The stories of its kings and gods lived on in successor cultures, and then the ruins of its great ziggurat inspired awe for generations. Archaeologists have uncovered a wealth of information from the city, piecing together its rise and fall through tablets, artifacts, and architectural remains. The tale of Ur is more than a cautionary tale. It is also a reminder of the resilience of cultural memory. Though the city itself crumbled, its spirit continued in the civilizations that followed. Today, the site of Ur lies quiet in the desert of modern-day Iraq. The ziggurat, partially restored, stands as a solemn sentinel over the sands of time. Visitors walk among the ruins, set up, imagining the bustling life that once filled its streets. They read the ancient lamentations and study the inscriptions left behind, seeking to understand how such a magnificent city could fall. The silence of Ur speaks volumes. It tells of glory, ambition, struggle, and loss, but it also tells of human endurance, of our ceaseless drive to build, to organize, to worship, and to remember. The fall of Ur may seem distant, a relic of a long-forgotten past, but its echoes still resonate today, reminding us that civilizations are living things, capable of greatness, but also vulnerable to the forces of nature, mismanagement, and time. In learning from Ur's collapse, we reflect on the balance between power and humility, between growth and sustainability. The story of Ur is not just about what was lost, but about what we choose to carry forward. It is a tale etched into the bedrock of history, waiting to be retold with each new generation that looks to the past for wisdom. Nebuchadnezzar II and the Hanging Gardens. Nebuchadnezzar II, the most illustrious king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, ruled from 605 to 562 BCE, and left behind a legacy that has echoed through time as one of architectural marvels, military conquests, and cultural flourishing. Among the many feats attributed to him, none has captured the imagination of historians and dreamers alike more than the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Though the historical certainty of the gardens remains debated, the tale of Nebuchadnezzar and his dreamlike oasis endures as a symbol of ancient ingenuity and royal devotion. Nebuchadnezzar ascended the throne after the death of his father, Nabopolassar, the founder of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Under Nebuchadnezzar's command, Babylon reached its zenith in power, wealth, and architectural achievement. He was a brilliant strategist and an ambitious builder, orchestrating campaigns that expanded the empire's influence and commissioning massive construction projects that transformed Babylon into the jewel of the ancient Near East. Towering ziggurats, colossal walls, wide processional avenues, and gleaming palaces, his vision for Babylon was as grand as it was enduring. But amidst this grandeur, one mythic construction stood apart, a garden suspended in air, defying the harsh climate and gravity itself. According to ancient accounts, the Hanging Gardens were not merely a display of power, but a deeply personal creation. As the story goes, Nebuchadnezzar married a Median princess named Amytis. Raised in the lush forested mountains of her homeland, Amytis reportedly found the flat, sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia desolate and uninspiring. In a gesture of love and empathy, Nebuchadnezzar is said to have commissioned the creation of an artificial paradise to remind her of her green homeland, a vertical garden teeming with vibrant plants, cascading waterfalls, and shady terraces that climbed skyward like a verdant mountain. This garden, if it indeed existed, would have been a triumph of ancient engineering. Babylon's arid climate presented formidable challenges. Water was scarce, and the Tigris and Euphrates rivers were vital lifelines. Yet, the Hanging Gardens were described as having a complex irrigation system, possibly using a chain pump mechanism to draw water from the Euphrates to the highest terraces. This would have required not only technical innovation, but also a vast labor force and meticulous planning, traits that characterized Nebuchadnezzar's reign. The gardens were said to be built on stone terraces supported by massive vaults, each level supporting soil deep enough to sustain large trees and flowering plants. The air would have been perfumed with blossoms, the walls adorned with greenery, and the sound of water echoing through the chambers, an Eden in the heart of the desert. Descriptions of the Hanging Gardens come primarily from later Greek historians such as Strabo, Philo of Byzantium, and Diodorus Siculus. These sources, written centuries after Nebuchadnezzar's reign, paint a picture of an unparalleled feat of horticultural architecture. Yet, curiously, there is a conspicuous absence of direct Babylonian records confirming the garden's existence. This silence in the cuneiform inscriptions and archaeological record has led some modern scholars to doubt whether the gardens ever existed in Babylon at all. Some suggest that the gardens may have been located in Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, and mistakenly attributed to Nebuchadnezzar by later writers. Others argue that the gardens were real but destroyed without leaving enough trace. Despite the historical uncertainty, the story of the Hanging Gardens is intimately tied to the character of Nebuchadnezzar himself. He was not just a warlord or empire builder, but a king attuned to beauty, emotion, and spectacle. His city of Babylon reflected this duality. It was both a fortress and a temple to human ambition. The Ishtar Gate, for example, with its brilliant blue tiles and procession of lions and dragons, was a gateway to another world, combining military might with divine reverence. The Ziggurat Ermenki, believed to have inspired the biblical Tower of Babel, soared into the sky, connecting heaven and earth in a symbolic statement of divine kingship. Within this cultural and architectural milieu, the Hanging Gardens, real or imagined, fit naturally into the broader theme of Nebuchadnezzar's rule, monumental, personal, and transcendent. Beyond the gardens, Nebuchadnezzar's rule was marked by sweeping religious and civic reforms. He restored temples, promoted the worship of Marduk, Babylon's chief deity, and centralized power in the capital. He also left a mark on the history of the Hebrew people. The Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem and the destruction of the First Temple occurred under his reign, leading to the Babylonian exile, a formative event in Jewish history. Biblical accounts portray him as a figure of both wrath and humility, including stories of his dreams and eventual humbling by God, suggesting a king who was both larger than life and yet subject to divine judgment. The gardens, then, take on a symbolic dimension in the context of Nebuchadnezzar's legacy. Whether or not they physically existed, they represent the king's desire to create harmony between nature and civilization, love and duty, myth and reality. They symbolize the longing to transcend one's environment, to bend nature to human will not out of hubris, but out of affection and beauty. This vision resonates through time as a testament to the heights that human imagination and effort can reach when driven by emotion as much as ambition. Archaeological evidence of Nebuchadnezzar's grandeur is abundant, even if the gardens themselves remain elusive. Excavations in Babylon have uncovered palace foundations, temple ruins, and segments of the famous processional way. Cuneiform inscriptions detail his building projects and victories, revealing a ruler who viewed construction as a sacred act, an offering to the gods and a legacy for the ages. Yet no definitive trace of the gardens has been found, leaving a tantalizing void filled with speculation, poetry, and artistic interpretation. The enduring allure of the Hanging Gardens lies in their mystery. They invite us to imagine what it must have been like to walk through towering terraces filled with the scent of jasmine and myrtle, shaded by palms and pines, with the murmur of water in the background and the sun filtering through layers of green. They represent an ideal, a blending of human love, natural beauty, and engineering genius. Whether the gardens bloomed in real soil or only in the fertile minds of ancient storytellers, their legacy is alive in our collective imagination. Nebuchadnezzar II remains one of history's most enigmatic and powerful rulers. His reign defined an era of revival and innovation, transforming Babylon into a cultural and political epicenter of the ancient world. The story of the Hanging Gardens adds a human dimension to this king of conquerors, a glimpse into a man who, amid wars and temples, also built a garden for love. In doing so, he not only carved his name into stone, but also into the mythic memory of mankind. Even in their absence, the Hanging Gardens speak to the timeless human yearning to shape the world into something more beautiful, more compassionate, and more eternal. The legacy of Nebuchadnezzar II and the Hanging Gardens endures not only in scholarly debate and historical records, but also in the countless works of art, literature, and architecture inspired by their legend. From Renaissance paintings to modern novels, from archaeological expeditions to imaginative reconstructions, the story continues to captivate minds across generations. In this enduring tale, Nebuchadnezzar becomes more than a king. He is a symbol of the eternal tension between the ephemeral and the everlasting, the earthly and the divine. His achievements, real or imagined, invite us to explore the boundaries of what civilization can create when guided by vision, devotion, and boldness. Even today, Babylon and its elusive garden remind us that not all legacies are carved in stone. Some are rooted in stories, stories that reflect our deepest values, our hopes for beauty amidst hardship, and our capacity to dream beyond the constraints of our world. Whether the Hanging Gardens were a physical paradise or a poetic invention, their story remains one of the most powerful expressions of humanity's desire to rise above its environment, to nurture, to remember, and to transform. In the tale of Nebuchadnezzar II, we find not just a chapter of history, but a mirror held up to our aspirations. Writing in schools in Mesopotamian society. In the cradle of civilization, amidst the fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the people of ancient Mesopotamia developed one of humanity's most profound innovations, writing. This invention, which emerged not for literature or art, but for practical purposes like accounting and administration, would ultimately become the foundation of Mesopotamian culture, governance, and education. Writing in Mesopotamia was not just a tool, it was a powerful instrument that shaped how society functioned, how knowledge was preserved, and how generations were educated. The earliest form of writing in Mesopotamia, known as cuneiform, began around 3200 BCE in the city of Uruk. Originally, it was a pictographic system, small images or symbols representing objects and ideas. Over time, these symbols evolved into more abstract signs, pressed into soft clay using a reed stylus, giving the script its characteristic wedge-shaped marks. This transformation allowed for greater speed and complexity in writing, opening the door to recording everything from trade transactions and laws to prayers and royal proclamations. The system became so effective that it remained in use for over 3,000 years, adapted by various Mesopotamian civilizations, including the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians. As writing became indispensable to administration and culture, it gave rise to a new societal institution, the school. Known in Sumerian as the Eduba, or tablet house, schools were established to train scribes, the professional writers of the ancient world. These scribes were the backbone of Mesopotamian bureaucracy. They recorded land ownership, tax collections, temple inventories, military orders, and diplomatic correspondence. The training to become a scribe was long and arduous, often beginning in early childhood and continuing for many years under the tutelage of experienced instructors. Students practiced by copying models onto clay tablets, repeating standard texts, and memorizing long lists of signs and vocabulary. Life in the Eduba was demanding. Discipline was strict and mistakes were not taken lightly. Historical tablets include complaints from students about beatings for errors or disobedience, reflecting the seriousness with which education was approached. Yet, the rigorous training produced highly skilled scribes capable of managing the complex administration of city-states and empires. Being a scribe offered a rare opportunity for social mobility. In a largely agricultural and labor-intensive society, literacy conferred power and prestige. Many scribes worked in temples or royal courts, while others became scholars, priests, or high-ranking officials. The curriculum of the Aduba extended beyond writing. Students were introduced to mathematics, literature, law, and religious texts. They studied classic stories like the Epic of Gilgamesh, proverbs, hymns, and lamentations. They also learned to calculate using a base 60 number system, a legacy still evident today in our division of hours and circles. Through this education, scribes were not merely clerks, but intellectuals, trained in the worldview and values of their civilization. They preserved cultural memory, recorded astronomical observations, and developed early scientific thinking. The role of writing in Mesopotamian religion and politics further elevated its importance. Temples, the spiritual centers of city life, relied on scribes to document offerings, rituals, and divine omens. Kings used inscriptions to legitimize their rule, recount victories, and proclaim laws. Hammurabi's famous law code, carved into a basalt stele, illustrates how writing became a tool for authority and justice. The ability to read and write was, in many ways, the dividing line between the ruling elite and the general populace. While the majority of the population was illiterate, scribes held a monopoly on the written word and, by extension, access to legal, economic, and religious power. Mesopotamian writing also enabled the expansion of trade and diplomacy. As city-states and empires grew, they established networks across the Near East, exchanging goods, ideas, and letters. Archives discovered in places like Mari and Ebla contain thousands of tablets, diplomatic dispatches, marriage contracts, treaties, and trade agreements, showing the sophisticated level of written communication between polities. Writing made it possible to maintain consistent records over vast distances and long periods, fostering a sense of order and continuity that oral tradition alone could not achieve. In addition to official and religious uses, writing in Mesopotamia also served personal and artistic expression. Some tablets contain letters from parents to children, merchants to partners, and lovers to one another. Others feature riddles, incantations, and even playful insults between students. These glimpses into everyday life reveal a society deeply engaged with writing, not just as a functional necessity, but as a medium for emotion, humor, and identity. It is through these varied uses that we understand writing as a living, evolving practice that permeated every level of society. Despite the dominance of cuneiform, writing in Mesopotamia was not static. Different languages were written using the same script: Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, and each brought new nuances to the written form. As empires rose and fell, scribes adapted the script to new administrative needs and cultural contexts. Over time, the complexity of cuneiform made it less accessible, and other simpler writing systems like the Aramaic alphabet began to replace it. Yet, the legacy of cuneiform endures as one of the most influential inventions in human history. The very act of writing in Mesopotamia carried symbolic and sacred weight. Scribes often invoked divine favor before writing, viewing the skill as a gift from the gods. Nabu, the Babylonian god of wisdom and writing, was venerated as the patron of scribes. His symbol, the stylus, became an emblem of learning and authority. This reverence for the written word reflects how profoundly writing was embedded in the spiritual and intellectual fabric of Mesopotamian life. Archaeological discoveries of libraries and archives across Mesopotamia attest to the value placed on written knowledge. The library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, dating to the 7th century BCE, housed tens of thousands of clay tablets and remains one of the oldest known libraries. Its contents ranged from religious texts and historical records to medicine, magic, and astrology. Such repositories were not merely storerooms, but centers of scholarship, where knowledge was preserved, studied, and passed on. The survival of these tablets, thanks to the durability of clay and the occasional accident of fire hardening them, offers modern historians an unparalleled window into the thoughts, beliefs, and daily lives of the ancient Mesopotamians. In the context of Mesopotamian society, writing in schools formed the backbone of civilization. They created a structured way to transmit knowledge, administer vast territories, and maintain cultural coherence across generations. The institution of the Aduba was more than just a school. It was a crucible of civilization where literacy was not merely taught, but celebrated, disciplined, and revered. Through the meticulous labor of countless scribes, Mesopotamia bequeathed to the world a treasure trove of written heritage, from legal codes and epic poetry to astronomical observations and philosophical musings. In retrospect, it is no exaggeration to say that the development of writing and formal education in Mesopotamia marked a turning point in human history. The shift from oral to written culture changed how people thought, remembered, and organized their societies. Writing allowed for abstraction, continuity, and critical reflection in ways that oral traditions could not. It made possible the accumulation of knowledge, the recording of complex transactions, and the articulation of law and governance. It allowed empires to be built and ruled with precision. It gave birth to history, literature, and science. The Mesopotamians may not have foreseen the full impact of their invention, but their legacy continues to shape the modern world. Every time we write, record, or communicate across time and space, we echo the strokes of a scribe's stylus in the soft clay of an ancient tablet. The silent classrooms of the Adaba, filled with the rhythmic tapping of styluses and the stern guidance of teachers, laid the foundations not just for their civilization, but for ours as well. Rediscovering Mesopotamia, Archaeology and Modern Insight. The land between the rivers, Mesopotamia, is often hailed as the cradle of civilization. Nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates, it gave rise to the world's earliest cities, legal codes, writing systems, and monumental architecture. But for centuries, the world forgot about Mesopotamia. Its cities turned to dust, its languages fell silent, and its gods faded into obscurity. It wasn't until the 19th century that a spark of curiosity reignited global interest in this ancient world. Through archaeology, we began to peel back the layers of time and uncover a civilization that not only shaped the ancient world, but continues to influence our modern understanding of law, science, society, and storytelling. Rediscovering Mesopotamia isn't just a journey into the past, it's a mirror reflecting who we are today and how we came to be. The first explorers of ancient Mesopotamia weren't always scientists or scholars. Many were adventurers, colonial agents, or clergymen, driven as much by myth and biblical intrigue as by historical curiosity. When European travelers ventured into Iraq, Syria, and surrounding regions in the early 1800s, they encountered massive mounds, seemingly natural hills, scattered across the landscape. These mounds, known as tells, were in fact the accumulated ruins of ancient cities, buried under layers of occupation, destruction, and time. As the first shovels pierced the earth at places like Nineveh and Nimrud, what emerged was astonishing. Colossal statues, walls inscribed with strange wedge-shaped writing, and artifacts hinting at an advanced and literate civilization lost to memory. One of the most groundbreaking discoveries came from the ruins of Nineveh when British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard unearthed the library of Ashurbanipal, one of the richest archaeological finds of the 19th century. Thousands of clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform script were found carefully stored in shelves, detailing everything from royal decrees and religious hymns to medical prescriptions and epic poetry. Among these tablets was the Epic of Gilgamesh, a tale so ancient and yet so deeply human that it resonates to this day. Its themes, friendship, mortality, the search for meaning, connect us to people who lived thousands of years ago. Through archaeology, Mesopotamian voices once silenced by time began to speak again. As archaeology evolved from treasure hunting to a more scientific discipline, the methods used to study Mesopotamia became more precise, revealing layers of history that once coexisted or overlapped. Excavations at sites like Eridu, and Babylon have given us a detailed picture of urban development over millennia. At Sir Leonard Woolley uncovered the royal cemetery, complete with golden headdresses, musical instruments, and the remains of court attendants buried alongside their rulers. These finds gave us insight not just into Mesopotamian death rituals, but into the social structures, artistry, and daily life of its people. Meanwhile, at Babylon, archaeologists reconstructed parts of the famed Ishtar Gate, a dazzling entryway once covered in glazed blue tiles and adorned with lions, dragons, and bulls, symbols of divine protection and imperial power. Yet modern insight into Mesopotamia isn't limited to what we dig out of the ground. Today's archaeologists work closely with technologies that the early pioneers could never have dreamed of: ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, and drone-based mapping now allow researchers to detect buried structures without disturbing the Earth. These non-invasive techniques have uncovered entire city layouts, road systems, irrigation networks, and even traces of shifting river courses that dictated where cities could thrive. With modern tools, we're not just excavating, we're reconstructing ancient worlds in 3 dimensions. One of the greatest challenges in studying Mesopotamia is its sheer age. We're dealing with civilizations that rose and fell over a span of more than 3,000 years. The Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians all left their mark, often building atop or repurposing the ruins of those who came before. This layering of history is both a blessing and a curse. It gives us a complex, continuous record of human development, but it also makes interpretation difficult. A wall from one period may be rebuilt in another, and a temple may be reused by successive cultures, each leaving behind different meanings. Modern archaeology, with its interdisciplinary approach, now draws on linguistics, geology, chemistry, and computer modeling to make sense of this rich and complicated past. Perhaps what's most remarkable is how much Mesopotamian thought has endured in modern consciousness. Concepts like legal accountability, recorded history, mathematics based on a sexagesimal system, which is why we still divide hours into 60 minutes, and even basic astronomy all trace their roots to this land. The Code of Hammurabi, etched onto a basalt stele nearly 4,000 years ago, laid out laws that governed everything from marriage to property disputes. Its famous preamble, declaring the king's duty to uphold justice for the weak and the poor, reflects values that echo through modern legal systems. Rediscovering Mesopotamia is also rediscovering the foundations of civilization itself. In recent decades, however, rediscovering Mesopotamia has taken on a new urgency. Wars, looting, and urban development have imperiled many archaeological sites. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the subsequent instability led to the widespread looting of museums and sites, scattering artifacts into the black market and irreversibly damaging ancient ruins. ISIS's deliberate destruction of sites like Nimrud and the Mosul Museum dealt further blows to the region's cultural heritage. In response, archaeologists and cultural preservationists have turned to digital technologies such as 3D scanning and virtual reconstruction to salvage what they can. These efforts not only preserve knowledge, but also make it globally accessible, allowing people around the world to explore the wonders of Mesopotamia through virtual reality and digital archives. At the same time, there's a growing recognition that the story of Mesopotamia cannot be told solely through Western eyes. Local scholars, museums, and communities are playing an increasingly vital role in preserving and interpreting their own heritage. Projects that collaborate with Iraqi and Syrian archaeologists have helped to train a new generation of experts who are reclaiming stewardship over their ancestral past. There's a powerful shift happening, from discovery to ownership, from extraction to collaboration. It's not just about digging up the past, but about restoring dignity, identity, and memory to the cultures that emerged from this land. As modern archaeology progresses, so too does our understanding of Mesopotamian society beyond kings and empires. Everyday life in cities like Lagash, Nippur, and Mari is now emerging from the shadows. Cuneiform tablets, once thought mundane, records of grain shipments, marriage contracts, school exercises, have proven to be a treasure trove of information. They show us a society humming with complexity, where merchants recorded transactions, children attended scribal schools, and temple economies functioned as powerful bureaucratic institutions. Through these documents, we gain a sense of people as individuals: workers negotiating wages, parents arranging marriages, citizens petitioning their rulers. We come to see not only the rulers and gods, but also the bakers, the shepherds, the midwives, the teachers, the human fabric of a civilization that once seemed mythic. One of the most compelling insights offered by modern Mesopotamian archaeology is the emergence of urban planning. The city of Uruk, widely considered the world's first true city, was already showing signs of deliberate design more than 5,000 years ago. Streets were laid out to guide foot traffic, canals regulated irrigation and trade, monumental architecture, including temples known as Ziggurats, served as central points for both religious and civic life. These were not haphazard agglomerations of huts and markets. They were sophisticated centers of administration and belief, and their ruins tell us about the ideology of space, hierarchy, and control that underpinned Mesopotamian thinking. Temples, palaces, and granaries were not just physical structures, they were ideological statements. They told a story of order, divine favor, and authority. New excavations continue to surprise us. In southern Iraq, the city of Lagash is now being investigated with remote sensing technologies that suggest a previously unknown scale of urban development. What once seemed like isolated outposts are now understood as part of vast, interconnected cityscapes, with networks of trade, communication, and infrastructure stretching across hundreds of kilometers. This has forced scholars to rethink old assumptions about population size, administrative reach, and even the causes of collapse. Were these cities abandoned due to climate shifts, internal strife, or the overextension of their own innovations? In asking such questions, we find that the past often echoes the challenges of the present. One area where modern insight has dramatically reshaped our understanding is agriculture. While Mesopotamia has long been credited as one of the first places to practice systematic farming, we now know this process was far more adaptive and innovative than previously believed. The ancient Mesopotamians engineered intricate irrigation systems to harness the unpredictable floods of the Tigris and Euphrates. They created levees, canals, and dikes to divert water during dry seasons and prevent destruction during flood seasons. These systems required constant maintenance, cooperation, and centralized management, a factor that likely contributed to the rise of complex bureaucratic states. Agriculture wasn't just about food. It was about governance, planning, and the long-term survival of a civilization. Yet, for all their brilliance, Mesopotamian civilizations were also deeply aware of their vulnerability. The constant battle with nature, the cycles of rise and fall, and the unpredictability of the gods are themes that run through their texts and monuments. The famous Sumerian lamentations, found etched into tablets from destroyed cities, mourn not just the loss of buildings but the disruption of cosmic order. Cities were seen as reflections of divine favor. When they fell, it wasn't just a political failure, but a sign that the gods had withdrawn their support. This perspective, so foreign to modern secular sensibilities, infused every aspect of Mesopotamian life, from politics to poetry, from trade to theology. Another fascinating area of rediscovery involves Mesopotamian science. Far from being solely spiritual or mythic, Mesopotamian thinkers made enormous contributions to mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. They developed a base 60 number system that influenced our concepts of time and geometry. They cataloged star patterns, recorded eclipses, and calculated planetary movements with surprising accuracy. Their knowledge was not only recorded but systematized. Astronomers kept tables of celestial events, while physicians wrote diagnostic texts with symptoms, prognoses, and treatments. These were not the superstitious scribblings of an ignorant people. They were the empirical observations of a highly literate and analytical society. And yet, even with all our modern technologies and methods, much of Mesopotamia remains buried. Political instability and conflict have made large-scale excavations difficult or impossible in many parts of Iraq and Syria. Entire cities lie untouched beneath fields and deserts, their secrets locked away by the weight of history and the complexities of the modern world. For archaeologists, each delay is a race against time, not just because of erosion or looting, but because every passing year distances the people of the present from the heritage of their past. The fragility of these sites is matched only by their importance. They are not just the ruins of buildings, they are the blueprints of civilization. International cooperation is now more crucial than ever. Organizations like UNESCO, the World Monuments Fund, and the Global Heritage Fund work alongside local governments to protect and preserve what remains. Scholars from around the world, linguists, historians, architects, digital modelers, are collaborating on open access projects that make Mesopotamian knowledge available to all. From 3D reconstructions of Babylon to interactive maps of ancient trade routes, we are entering an era where the boundaries of time and space can be digitally transcended. A student in Tokyo, a teacher in Nairobi, a filmmaker in Sao Paulo, they can all now walk through the streets of Ur or explore the halls of Nineveh with nothing more than a screen and an internet connection. What's Perhaps most profound in this rediscovery of Mesopotamia is how it forces us to reckon with continuity. The myths and systems we often think of as uniquely modern, centralized governance, written bureaucracy, standardization of law, complex city infrastructure, were all pioneered thousands of years ago in the very soil that now lies under dust and stone. To study Mesopotamia is to realize that history does not move in a straight line, but in cycles. We rise, we fall, we rebuild, we remember. The people of Uruk and Kish may be long gone, but their struggles and triumphs, their fears and hopes, their laws and their laments still whisper to us from across the ages. Rediscovering Mesopotamia is not just the work of scholars, it is a collective act of memory. It asks us to look inward, to see the ancient foundations beneath our modern lives, and to ask difficult questions about progress, permanence, and the legacy we ourselves will leave behind. As we continue to dig, scan, and decode, we're not just unearthing bricks and bones. We're piecing together a mosaic of human experience, one fragment at a time. Even in the face of adversity, the human impulse to preserve the past endures. Nowhere is this clearer than in the passionate efforts of archaeologists, historians, local citizens who risk their safety to protect the relics of Mesopotamian civilization. In Iraq, dedicated museum staff have hidden artifacts during times of war, moved collections to safe locations, and resisted looting even when under threat. Their actions are not just acts of professional duty, they are acts of cultural guardianship. These individuals understand that Mesopotamia does not belong to one country or even one region. It is the shared inheritance of all humankind. Its rediscovery is not just an academic pursuit. It is a global responsibility. Part of that responsibility includes reframing the narratives we tell about ancient civilizations. For too long, the story of Mesopotamia was filtered through a colonial lens, discovered by Western explorers, decoded by foreign linguists, and displayed in European museums far from their origins. While these scholars made invaluable contributions, the narrative has often excluded local voices and indigenous perspectives. Today, there is a conscious shift toward decolonizing archaeology, reintegrating the people whose heritage is being studied, and allowing them to be not just subjects of research, but authors of history. It's a transformation that's redefining what it means to rediscover a civilization. It's no longer just about what we find, but about who tells the story and why that story matters. Modern Mesopotamian archaeology is becoming a collaborative tapestry woven from both ancient clues and contemporary context. The cultural layers being studied are not just historical, they are personal. Many Iraqis and Syrians living near archaeological sites see these ruins as part of their everyday environment, not distant relics, but living reminders of deep time. In some cases, local communities have oral histories that echo long-forgotten myths. In others, traditional crafts like pottery, weaving, and brickmaking continue in forms strikingly similar to those used in ancient times. The past lives on, not just in museums, but in the hands and memories of people today. These connections between past and present are more than poetic. They have practical implications. Archaeological tourism, when done ethically and sustainably, can provide economic opportunities and foster pride in heritage. Sites like Babylon, Ur, and Erbil have the potential to become centers of education, cultural exchange, and national identity. But tourism must be balanced with protection. Too often, the rush to monetize heritage has led to irreparable damage, from overexposure to looting encouraged by demand. The challenge is to open the gates of the past while ensuring they remain intact for future generations. One fascinating example of modern insight is how archaeology interacts with climate science. Ancient Mesopotamians were deeply attuned to their environment. They had to be. The timing of floods, the salinity of soil, the direction of prevailing winds, these factors influenced everything from crop cycles to city locations. By analyzing ancient pollen, sediment layers, and irrigation channels, today's scientists are reconstructing the environmental conditions of thousands of years ago. In some cases, dramatic shifts, such as prolonged droughts, coincide with the decline of major cities. This has led some scholars to propose that climate change was not only a factor in ancient collapses, but that responses to environmental stress shaped entire civilizations. These findings resonate strongly in our own era as we face similar challenges of sustainability, water management, and ecological balance. Mesopotamia also continues to surprise us in the realm of cultural innovation. The development of writing, first pictographic, then cuneiform, is one of the most revolutionary events in human history. It was in Mesopotamia that symbols began to represent sounds, and language took on physical form. At first used for record keeping, counting sheep, recording taxes, noting temple offerings, writing quickly expanded into literature, law, science, and philosophy. The very act of inscribing thoughts into clay marks the dawn of history itself, distinguishing the prehistoric from the historical. And it was from this innovation that all written traditions eventually flowed: Akkadian, Aramaic, Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and beyond. But writing was not the only innovation. The wheel, too, was likely developed here, not just for transportation, but also for pottery. The use of standardized weights and measures, advanced metallurgy, monumental sculpture, and even rudimentary banking systems all emerged from the Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian cities. These were not isolated technologies. They were part of a coherent worldview, one that saw human beings as intermediaries between the divine and the earthly, responsible for maintaining cosmic order through proper rituals, laws, and labor. And while Mesopotamia was deeply religious, it was also remarkably diverse. Over its long history, the region was home to a mosaic of ethnic groups, languages, and belief systems. Sumerians, Akkadians, Amorites, Kassites, Assyrians, Chaldeans all lived, traded, and intermarried across the plains and river valleys. This diversity is preserved not just in ruins, but in linguistic texts, iconography, and administrative records. Even the pantheon of gods evolved over time. Gods were merged, adopted, renamed, or localized to specific cities. The result was a flexible yet deeply structured belief system that helped knit together multi-ethnic empires. This fluidity extended to cultural exchange. Mesopotamia was never a closed system. It was a hub of interaction. It traded goods and ideas with the Indus Valley to the east, Egypt to the west, Anatolia to the north, and the Persian Gulf to the south. Artifacts found far from Mesopotamia, cylinder seals, lapis lazuli, cuneiform tablets, tell stories of ancient globalization. Likewise, ideas about kingship, astronomy, and law spread outward, influencing distant societies. This interconnectedness is a reminder that no civilization exists in a vacuum. Even the earliest cities were part of a wider world. Today, as we reflect on Mesopotamia from the vantage point of satellites and supercomputers, one of the most humbling realizations is how little we still know. Thousands of sites remain unexcavated. Entire languages, like the mysterious Proto-Euphratean, have yet to be deciphered. Even major historical events, such as the fall of certain empires, remain open to debate. The study of Mesopotamia is, in many ways, still in its infancy. Each new find challenges assumptions and raises fresh questions. It is a field where certainty is rare and curiosity is essential. But perhaps that's the most beautiful part of this rediscovery. Mesopotamia does not give up its secrets easily. It asks us to listen carefully to its broken statues, its buried tablets, its silent streets. It invites us to piece together meaning from fragments, to learn patience, humility, and wonder. In doing so, it teaches us something not only about the past, but about ourselves. The rise of Sumer and cuneiform. In the cradle of civilization, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers snake through the vast sun-scorched plains of Mesopotamia, a remarkable chapter of human history began to unfold. A chapter that would forever alter the course of humanity. It was here, in what is now southern Iraq, that the Sumerians emerged as one of the world's first complex societies, building a legacy that would reverberate through millennia. The rise of Sumer and the development of cuneiform writing were not isolated marvels, but deeply interconnected achievements that signaled the dawn of organized civilization. As the floodwaters of these rivers receded seasonally, they left behind fertile soil, ideal for cultivation. It was on this land that the Sumerians laid the foundations for the first true cities, establishing agricultural practices, trade systems, religious institutions, and most notably, the earliest form of writing known to humankind. The story of Sumer is one of ingenuity and adaptation. These people did not simply settle in the region, they transformed it. By constructing intricate irrigation canals and managing the unpredictable river flows, the Sumerians turned arid landscapes into productive farmland, supporting larger populations and enabling the growth of city-states such as Uruk, Eridu, and Lagash. These weren't mere villages or towns. They were urban centers, each with monumental architecture, bustling markets, and a structured form of governance. At the heart of every Sumerian city stood the ziggurat, a massive temple platform that not only dominated the skyline, but also represented the city's spiritual nucleus. Each city-state operated under the belief that it was under the protection of a patron deity, and the ruling elite, often priest-kings, claimed divine sanction for their authority. Religion and governance were inseparable in Sumerian society, deeply woven into the fabric of daily life and statecraft. Yet the rise of Sumer was more than a material or political triumph. It was an intellectual one. Faced with the growing complexities of managing agricultural output, trade inventories, religious rituals, and legal disputes, the Sumerians began to innovate a system of record keeping. Initially, this took the form of simple pictographs carved into clay tokens and tablets. These symbols, representing commodities such as grain, cattle, or cloth, were used in administrative settings to track goods and labor. But over time, this rudimentary form of communication evolved into something far more revolutionary: cuneiform writing. Named for the wedge-shaped impressions made by a stylus on clay, cuneiform was not merely a tool for inventory management. It became a conduit for expression, a medium for literature, law, and historical memory. Cuneiform emerged around 3200 BCE, and its development was one of the greatest cognitive leaps in human history. The earliest texts were utilitarian, serving as ledgers and transaction records. However, as the writing system became more sophisticated, it began to encompass a broader range of human experience. Cuneiform tablets recorded myths, hymns, prayers, proverbs, and even lamentations. Among the most famous of these is the Epic of Gilgamesh, an early masterpiece of world literature that reflects the philosophical and spiritual concerns of the Sumerian people. In these narratives, we see the seeds of existential questioning, of grappling with mortality, friendship, and the limits of human ambition, ideas that still resonate deeply with modern audiences. But the significance of cuneiform was not limited to poetry or religious thought. It was instrumental in shaping the administrative and legal frameworks that held Sumerian society together. It enabled the codification of laws and the formalization of property ownership, contracts, and diplomatic correspondence. The power of writing to stabilize and centralize authority cannot be overstated. It allowed rulers and priests to standardize rituals, legitimize power through divine claims, and maintain consistency in governance across sprawling city-states. It's no exaggeration to say that writing became the nervous system of the early state, transmitting information across time and space with unprecedented precision. The social impact of this innovation was equally profound. Literacy, though limited to a small class of scribes, became a revered skill, requiring years of rigorous training in special schools known as edubas. These scribes were more than mere record keepers. They were intellectuals, legal experts, and cultural custodians. Their clay tablets, many of which have survived the ravages of time, offer a window into the day-to-day realities of Sumerian life: contracts, business dealings, school exercises, and even jokes. They reveal a society grappling with the same complexities that challenge us today: governance, fairness, ambition, love, and legacy. The rise of Sumer and cuneiform also had a ripple effect throughout the ancient Near East. Neighboring cultures such as the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians would adopt and adapt the cuneiform script, incorporating it into their own languages and administrations. This interconnection created a shared linguistic and bureaucratic culture across Mesopotamia, facilitating diplomacy, trade, and cultural exchange. It's remarkable to consider how a system born out of the need to count sheep and jars of oil grew into the vehicle for empires to proclaim their decrees, for poets to ponder the cosmos, and for generations to transmit their accumulated wisdom. Even in decline, the influence of Sumer lingered. Though the political dominance of the Sumerians waned under the rise of the Akkadian Empire and later Babylonian and Assyrian powers, the intellectual and cultural framework they built endured. Cuneiform continued to be used for over 3,000 years, long after Sumer had faded as a distinct political entity. The institutions, urban design, literary forms, and legal practices pioneered by the Sumerians became templates for subsequent civilizations in the region. In this way, the spirit of Sumer persisted, etched into the clay of history. Today, when we consider what defines a civilization, the legacy of Sumer stands as an exemplar. The emergence of cities, formal governance, a stratified society, religious institutions, monumental architecture, and crucially, a writing system, all coalesced in the Sumerian world. These were not accidental developments, but the result of deliberate human effort to understand, organize, and transcend their environment. Their achievements marked a threshold, a shift from pre-literate nomadic existence to the recorded chronicle of human endeavor. The Sumerians were, in many ways, the first to write themselves into history. Modern archaeologists and scholars continue to uncover the echoes of Sumer's brilliance. Every unearthed tablet, every crumbling ziggurat, every fragment of an inscription adds to the tapestry of understanding. What began as impressions in soft clay has hardened into the enduring foundation of historical consciousness. The ability to record and transmit ideas across time was a gift not just to Mesopotamia, but to all humanity. In the rise of Sumer and the invention of cuneiform, we see more than the dawn of writing. We see the birth of memory, the scaffolding of civilization, and the start of our shared story. Trade, agriculture, and the birth of economy. Trade, agriculture, and the birth of economy are deeply intertwined forces that shape the very foundation of civilization. As early humans began transitioning from nomadic lifestyles to settled communities, the seeds of economic systems were sown in the soil of necessity and cooperation. At the heart of this transformation was agriculture, an innovation that not only provided a stable food source, but also allowed surplus production, which became the bedrock of trade and economic interaction. In the early days of human history, survival was largely dictated by the ability to hunt and gather, but as people discovered that seeds could be planted and crops harvested, an entirely new way of life emerged. Settlements began to form around fertile regions, such as those along the Tigris and Euphrates, the Nile, the Indus, and the Yellow River, giving rise to agrarian societies that no longer needed to roam in search of sustenance. With agriculture came the ability to produce more than what a family or small community could consume. This surplus was revolutionary. For the first time, people could exchange their excess food for other goods or services. Someone growing abundant wheat could trade with a neighbor skilled in pottery or weaving. This basic form of barter marked the beginning of trade, and with it, the birth of economy. Barter created a web of interdependence that extended beyond kinship ties and local bonds. It established relationships between different communities, enabling not just the exchange of goods, but also of ideas, technologies, and cultures. As societies became more complex, so did their trade networks. What began as simple exchanges between neighboring villages evolved into vast networks of trade connecting distant regions. Goods like obsidian, copper, spices, salt, and textiles moved across great distances, carried by caravans, riverboats, and eventually seafaring vessels. These exchanges were more than just transactions. They were the lifeblood of early civilizations, encouraging exploration and fostering diplomatic relationships. The need to measure and value goods gave rise to the earliest forms of accounting and record-keeping, seen most prominently in Mesopotamia, where clay tablets detailed inventories and transactions. To support this growing web of exchange, early societies began creating standardized units of trade. Livestock, grain, and eventually metal objects like silver rings or copper ingots served as mediums of exchange, precursors to money. This innovation simplified trade and allowed economies to flourish beyond the limitations of direct barter. With a common measure of value, people could save wealth, invest in future ventures, and create systems of debt and credit. In parallel, the agricultural revolution continued to evolve. As knowledge of irrigation, plowing, and crop rotation expanded, communities could produce even greater surpluses, further stimulating trade and giving rise to specialized professions. Not everyone needed to farm anymore. Artisans, priests, traders, and rulers emerged, each contributing to the growing complexity of early economies. Temples and palaces in ancient cities often served as both religious and economic centers, storing surplus grain, distributing food, and managing trade on behalf of the community. These institutions played a key role in organizing labor, distributing resources, and enforcing agreements, forming early prototypes of centralized economic management. This level of organization was essential for the construction of monumental architecture, irrigation systems, and defense structures. As populations grew, so did the complexity of their economies. Cities became hubs of production and exchange, connected by roads and rivers to distant regions. Markets emerged as central gathering places where people from all walks of life came together to buy, sell, and trade. These marketplaces were more than just centers of commerce. They were vibrant social and cultural spaces, reflecting the interconnectedness of economic activity with every facet of life. Over time, the limitations of barter and commodity-based exchange led to the invention of coinage. Around 600 BCE, the Lydians in Anatolia began minting the first metal coins, small stamped pieces of gold and silver that held intrinsic value and were widely accepted. This innovation transformed trade by making it faster, more reliable, and more scalable. Coins allowed for more complex transactions, enabled taxation, and facilitated the rise of merchant classes. Trade routes expanded into vast networks that spanned continents, including the Silk Road, which connected the East and West, and maritime routes across the Mediterranean and Indian Oceans. Along these routes, not only goods, but languages, religions, and technologies flowed, shaping the world in profound ways. The birth of the economy, therefore, was not a singular event, but an evolutionary process driven by human innovation, environmental adaptation, and the quest for better living conditions. Agriculture laid the groundwork by stabilizing food supplies and enabling surplus. Trade built upon that surplus, weaving a fabric of exchange and interaction that brought people together across distances. The economy emerged as a system, a living organism that connected the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services in an increasingly intricate dance. The concept of value began to expand beyond physical goods. Services, labor, and time became economic assets. A shepherd could be paid not just for his sheep, but for his expertise in managing them. A potter could earn value from the beauty and utility of their craft. Skills became commodities, and the human experience itself began to be shaped by economic participation. This evolution also brought challenges. Inequality arose as some accumulated more resources than others. Control of land, labor, and trade routes became sources of power and conflict. Societies developed hierarchies, often solidified through economic means. Kings, merchants, and landowners amassed wealth, while peasants and laborers struggled for sustenance. Yet, these dynamics also spurred innovation. Systems of governance, legal codes, and economic regulations were developed to manage resources and disputes. The Code of Hammurabi, for instance, included laws related to trade, property, and contracts, reflecting the growing importance of economic activity in maintaining social order. As empires rose and fell, the economy remained a central force, reshaped by conquests, discoveries, and technological advances. The Roman Empire built roads to support trade and commerce. The Islamic Golden Age saw the flourishing of trade across the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia, introducing banking systems, checks, and credit mechanisms that resemble those used today. The concept of markets matured, with bazaars, fairs, and trading ports becoming the lifeblood of medieval and early modern economies. Cities like Venice, Timbuktu, and Samarkand thrived as trade centers, drawing merchants, scholars, and adventurers from every corner of the known world. Even in its earliest form, the economy was not merely about goods and services. It was about people, how they connected, cooperated, and competed. It was about the choices they made and the values they shared. It was about survival, ambition, trust, and imagination. Trade taught humans to negotiate and to understand the needs of others. Agriculture taught them patience, planning, and the rhythm of nature. Together, they laid the foundation for everything from language and writing to mathematics and governance. In many ways, our modern world still runs on the same principles born thousands of years ago: the need to produce, the drive to exchange, and the systems we create to manage these processes. Today's global economy, with its digital currencies, complex supply chains, and abstract financial instruments, is a distant descendant of those early exchanges of grain for pottery or wool for salt. But at its core, it remains a human endeavor, shaped by the same impulses that led early farmers to plant seeds and early traders to strike bargains. The story of trade, agriculture, and the birth of the economy is not just a history of systems, it's a story of us, of how we learn to live together, share our resources, and imagine a future that we could build, piece by piece, through the simple act of exchange. Science and Mathematics in Ancient Mesopotamia. In the cradle of civilization, nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, ancient Mesopotamia gave birth not only to cities, writing, and law, but also to the foundations of science and mathematics. These early innovations were not merely the result of idle curiosity, but of necessity. With unpredictable rivers, complex agricultural cycles, and emerging urban societies, the people of Mesopotamia had to develop systems of knowledge that could provide order, predictability, and control over the natural world. In doing so, they laid the groundwork for disciplines that would one day shape the modern world. One of the most striking aspects of Mesopotamian science was its close relationship to the needs of everyday life. Their science was practical, deeply intertwined with religion, administration, and survival. The Mesopotamians were meticulous observers of the heavens and the earth, and from their observations they derived complex systems of knowledge. Their understanding of astronomy, for example, was driven by a desire to predict seasonal changes, religious festivals, and celestial omens. Priests and scribes kept detailed records of lunar phases, solar movements, eclipses, and planetary positions, believing these celestial patterns influenced both natural and human affairs. Over time, these records formed the basis of one of the most sophisticated astronomical traditions in the ancient world. By the first millennium BCE, Babylonian astronomers had begun to make surprisingly accurate predictions of celestial phenomena. They divided the sky into constellations and tracked the movement of planets through the zodiac. They were the first to recognize the periodicity of lunar eclipses and develop methods for predicting them with remarkable precision. They even used rudimentary forms of numerical models, early versions of algorithms to calculate planetary positions. Though these were not grounded in theoretical physics as we know it today, they represented a major intellectual achievement. Their goal was not abstract explanation, but prediction, and in this, they were often impressively successful. Mathematics in Mesopotamia was no less remarkable. The Babylonians inherited and refined the mathematical systems of their Sumerian predecessors. They operated with a sexagesimal, or base 60, number system, a system that still influences us today in the way we measure time and angles. This system allowed them to perform complex calculations with relative ease. Clay tablets from the Old Babylonian period reveal that they were capable of solving quadratic and even cubic equations. They had multiplication tables, reciprocal tables, square and cube roots, and methods for calculating areas and volumes. These tablets show a high degree of sophistication, with problem sets that resemble modern algebra exercises. Mesopotamian mathematicians also developed early forms of geometry. Though not abstract in the Euclidean sense, their geometric knowledge was functional and applicable. They used it to divide land, measure fields, construct buildings, and calculate the capacity of canals and granaries. One particularly famous artifact, the Plimpton 322 tablet, shows a list of Pythagorean triples, suggesting that they understood the relationship between the sides of a right triangle more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras. While it's unlikely that they thought of these relationships in the theoretical terms used by later Greek mathematicians, the practical accuracy of their calculations is undeniable. This emphasis on utility extended into their medical practices as well. Mesopotamian medicine combined empirical observation with spiritual belief. Diseases were seen as punishments from the gods or the result of demonic activity, yet many treatments were based on careful observation and trial and error methods. Clay tablets from ancient Assyria and Babylon describe hundreds of medical diagnoses and prescriptions. Physicians kept records of symptoms and outcomes, used a wide array of plants and minerals, and often prescribed specific dietary and behavioral changes. Despite the mystical framework, this reflects an early attempt to categorize illnesses and treat them systematically. Even in architecture and engineering, we see mathematical and scientific principles at work. The construction of massive ziggurats, aqueducts, and city walls required planning, measurement, and an understanding of physical forces. The cities of Mesopotamia were planned with canals, roads, and public buildings laid out in deliberate fashion, reflecting an appreciation for spatial organization and hydraulics. Their success in taming the floods of the Tigris and Euphrates, in building irrigation networks that sustained entire civilizations, was in itself a monumental achievement in applied science. What's truly fascinating is how the Mesopotamians documented all this knowledge. They inscribed their calculations, observations, and insights into clay tablets using cuneiform script. These tablets formed the curriculum of scribal schools, where students memorized and copied mathematical problems and astronomical records. These were not theoretical institutions, but practical ones, where knowledge was transmitted to serve the state, the temple, and society. The scribe was not only a recorder of words, but a practitioner of mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. The Babylonian approach to knowledge was distinct in that it was both empirical and systematic. Unlike the later Greek philosophers who sought to explain the universe in abstract terms, the Mesopotamians were more concerned with organizing information and deriving predictive power from it. This doesn't mean they lacked curiosity or intelligence. It simply reflects a different worldview, one in which knowledge served survival and ritual. Their calendars, for example, were based on precise lunar observations, allowing them to coordinate agricultural activities, religious festivals, and state affairs with a high degree of accuracy. This blend of observation, calculation, and administration helped maintain one of the world's first complex bureaucracies. Some of the most important legacies of Mesopotamian science and math can still be felt today. Our modern system of timekeeping, with 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour, stems directly from their base 60 numerical system. The 12 signs of the zodiac, the concept of degrees in a circle, and the division of the day into hours, these are remnants of Babylonian astronomical practice. Their influence extended through the Greeks, who translated and adapted Mesopotamian ideas, and through them into the Islamic and Western scientific traditions. Despite this, the brilliance of Mesopotamian science and mathematics was long underappreciated. For centuries, much of what we knew about the ancient world came through the lens of classical antiquity, particularly Greece and Rome. It wasn't until the deciphering of cuneiform in the 19th century that scholars began to uncover the true extent of Mesopotamian achievement. What emerged was a picture of a society deeply engaged with the natural world, equipped with a toolkit of mathematical and scientific techniques far more advanced than previously believed. Indeed, the Mesopotamians remind us that science is not the exclusive domain of modernity. Long before telescopes and laboratories, there were stargazers on ziggurats, scribes hunched over clay tablets, and engineers redirecting rivers to feed cities. These early scientists were driven by questions that still animate us today. How do we measure the world? How do we predict the future? How do we bring order to chaos? Their answers were rooted in their time, but their legacy is timeless. In the end, the story of science and mathematics in ancient Mesopotamia is one of both brilliance and humility. It shows us that even in a world filled with uncertainty and divine mystery, humans have always sought patterns, sought knowledge, and sought to understand the forces that shape our lives. The Mesopotamians, with their cuneiform tablets and celestial charts, were not just the first to write, but among the first to think scientifically. They left behind more than ruins. They left behind a spirit of inquiry that continues to guide us. The cradle of civilization, life between the rivers. In the arid heart of the ancient Near East, cradled between the winding curves of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, life began to pulse with an unprecedented rhythm. This stretch of fertile land, known as Mesopotamia, meaning between the rivers in Greek, witnessed the birth of human civilization as we know it. Long before the rise of the mighty pyramids in Egypt or the classical splendor of Greece and Rome, the people of Mesopotamia were already cultivating the soil, recording their thoughts on clay tablets, and building the frameworks of urban life. Here, in the soft alluvial plains watered by seasonal floods and carved by ingenious canals, humanity took its first steps toward organized society, writing, law, trade, and religion. The cradle of civilization, as it came to be known, was not just a geographic location. It was a cauldron of innovation, where necessity birthed ingenuity and survival sculpted culture. The people of Mesopotamia faced a harsh environment. With scorching summers, unpredictable floods, and little in the way of natural defenses, life in this land demanded resilience and adaptability. Yet it was precisely these challenges that spurred some of humanity's earliest achievements. To harness the chaotic waters of the rivers, they dug irrigation ditches and developed one of the earliest known systems of water management. This allowed them to transform barren land into a fertile patchwork of fields producing barley, wheat, dates, and flax. As food surpluses grew, so did the population, and soon scattered villages evolved into thriving city-states. Uruk, Lagash, and Eridu among them, each with its own ruler, deity, and distinct identity. Urban life introduced complexities never before encountered by human communities. With so many people living close together, issues of governance, resource allocation, and social order became critical. To meet these demands, the Mesopotamians crafted administrative systems, developed record-keeping, and gave rise to one of the greatest innovations in human history: writing. The earliest form of writing, cuneiform, was first etched into clay tablets with a reed stylus. Initially used to track grain, livestock, and labor, this system quickly evolved to include literature, law, and historical records. It gave voice to the concerns and aspirations of a people stepping into the light of history, and it ensured that their legacy would endure for millennia. In these city-states, monumental architecture became both a symbol of divine favor and a testament to human ambition. Towering ziggurats rose above the city skylines, massive terrace structures built to bring the people closer to the gods. These temples, dedicated to deities such as Anu, Enlil, and Inanna, were spiritual and administrative centers where priests played powerful roles in both religion and politics. The Mesopotamians believed the gods controlled every aspect of existence, from the rising of the sun to the flooding of the rivers, and sought to appease them through rituals, offerings, and the construction of grand temples. Religion infused every part of life, creating a worldview that was both awe-inspiring and deeply intertwined with the uncertainties of nature. Alongside spiritual development came the birth of law and order. One of the most enduring legacies of Mesopotamia is the Code of Hammurabi, a comprehensive set of laws engraved on a basalt stele around 1754 BCE by the Babylonian king Hammurabi. These laws covered everything from trade disputes to family relationships and punishments for theft or assault, often with harsh consequences. While the justice they prescribed could be severe, the mere existence of a codified legal system marked a significant leap in human society. It acknowledged the necessity of shared rules and consequences, reflecting a collective agreement to manage human behavior through structured principles. Trade and commerce flourished in this environment of organized society and surplus production. Mesopotamia, lacking in natural resources like timber, stone, and metals, became a hub of trade, exchanging its agricultural products and finely crafted goods for materials from as far as the Indus Valley, Anatolia, and the Levant. Merchants, using cuneiform tablets to document their transactions, helped knit together a vast network of economic interdependence. These early markets laid the groundwork for financial systems that would one day span the globe. But Mesopotamia was not merely a place of commerce and governance, it was also a wellspring of culture. The Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians who ruled and inhabited the land left behind a rich trove of intellectual and artistic achievements. They studied the stars, charted constellations, and developed early forms of mathematics and geometry. They composed hymns, myths, and epic poetry, including the legendary Epic of Gilgamesh, a profound exploration of mortality, friendship, and the search for meaning. This literary masterpiece, inscribed on clay tablets, is one of the oldest surviving works of literature and continues to resonate with readers today. As dynasties rose and fell, Mesopotamia became a stage upon which the drama of power played out in full force. Empires like that of Sargon of Akkad, who created one of the first known empires by uniting much of Mesopotamia under one rule, introduced the concept of centralized administration on a grand scale. Later, the Babylonians and Assyrians would carry this torch, extending their influence across vast regions through military might and sophisticated bureaucracy. These empires not only spread Mesopotamian culture and innovations far and wide, but also absorbed influences from conquered peoples, enriching the region's tapestry of knowledge and belief. Yet life in Mesopotamia was far from static. The same rivers that nurtured agriculture could also bring ruin, flooding unpredictably and destroying entire settlements. Shifts in climate, depletion of resources, and the pressures of war all took their toll. Cities that once teemed with life fell into ruin, their great temples buried beneath centuries of dust. But the imprint they left on human history would not fade. Mesopotamia's legacy lived on in the systems of writing, law, astronomy, and governance that would influence civilizations from the Mediterranean to the Indus and beyond. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Mesopotamia's legacy is its enduring relevance. The challenges its people faced, scarcity, conflict, environmental uncertainty, and the search for meaning, are not so different from those we grapple with today. The ingenuity with which they responded, the institutions they built, and the stories they told offer timeless insights into the human condition. In their triumphs and failures, we see reflections of ourselves. The cradle of civilization was more than just the beginning of cities, laws, and writing. It was the awakening of collective human consciousness. It was where people first dreamed of a world shaped by their own hands, where myth merged with history, and where the raw elements of survival were alchemized into the foundations of culture. Every monument unearthed, every tablet deciphered, adds another piece to the grand mosaic of our shared heritage. And though the sounds of their cities have long since quieted, the echoes of life between the rivers still whisper through the ages, reminding us that from this ancient soil grew the first roots of the modern world. Even as the physical remnants of Mesopotamian civilization slowly crumbled beneath layers of earth and time, the ideas born there refused to be buried. The Mesopotamians' innovations in writing, legal systems, agriculture, and architecture set the template for countless societies to come. Their systems of record-keeping evolved into more refined scripts and eventually into alphabets. Their legal traditions inspired the judicial foundations of empires and modern states alike. Their mythologies, passed from clay tablet to oral tradition to text, influenced later religious and philosophical thought across the ancient world. The Ziggurats they built, once towering monuments to the gods, inspired later sacred architecture. Their stepped form echoed in structures as distant as Mesoamerica. The land between the rivers was not merely a geographical setting, it was a philosophical and spiritual frontier. Here, humanity first grappled with the overwhelming forces of nature, with mortality and with the concept of divine will. Here, we first questioned the meaning of life, the structure of society, and the shape of the cosmos. The legacy of Mesopotamia, then, is not only historical, it is profoundly human. It is a story of creativity forged from hardship and of civilization rising from mud brick foundations to inspire generations yet unborn.